Hi guys, that night, a secret no one knew slowly began to surface. Before we start, likes and subscribes help me keep making these. Where are you listening from? Drop your city and time in the comments. I'm always reading them, thinking, wait, people in Texas listen to history stories to sleep. Okay, tonight we're talking about the forgotten postal inspectors of 1892. But before we go anywhere, get cosy. Pillows good, blanket situation handled, perfect. Trust me on this one. Picture yourself standing on a rain-slicked cobblestone street in Philadelphia, October 1892. The street is imbued with the ever-present scent of horses. You can hear the distant clatter of a horse-drawn mail wagon making its rounds, the sound echoing off brick buildings that seem to lean inward, as if they're keeping secrets of their own. The air smells like coal smoke and damp wool, that particular scent of autumn in a city that's growing faster than anyone expected. You're holding a leather satchel, worn smooth at the corners from years of use, and inside it are documents that most people will never see. Reports written in careful script about crimes so mundane they barely register as crimes at all. But I haven't told you the most important part yet. You're a postal inspector, one of roughly 200 men scattered across the United States, tasked with investigating mail fraud, theft, and irregularities in a system that handles millions of letters each week. The job sounds simple enough until you realise that in 1892, the postal system is the only reliable way most Americans communicate across distance. Every love letter, every business contract, every pension check, every mail order catalogue flows through this network, and your job is to make sure it all arrives intact. Responsibility weighs on you, though you'd never say so out loud. In your pocket, there's a small notebook with a black cover, its pages filled with names, addresses, and cryptic observations, written in shorthand only you can read. 3 weeks ago, you started noticing a pattern in missing mail from a particular route. Letters that vanished between the sorting facility and their final destinations. Always on Thursdays. Always between 2 and 4 in the afternoon. The thing about patterns is they make you curious, and curiosity in this line of work leads you down alleyways you wouldn't normally walk, into conversations with people who'd rather not talk to anyone wearing a badge, even one as unassuming as yours. You've learned that postal inspectors exist in a strange space between law enforcement and bureaucracy, respected by neither, but necessary to both. Police officers think you're glorified clerks. Clerks think you're overzealous troublemakers. The truth, as usual, sits somewhere in the middle, in that grey zone where most real work actually gets done. Tonight you're meeting an informant, a letter carrier named Thomas Whelan who's worked the Northern District for 12 years and recently noticed something odd about his supervisor's behaviour. The rain picks up, drumming against your hat brim, and you pull your coat tighter. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls 8 times, the sound muffled by fog rolling in from the Delaware River. You wonder, not for the first time, if anyone outside your small circle of colleagues understands what you actually do, or if they even care. Postal inspection isn't glamorous. There are no shootouts, no dramatic arrests in crowded train stations, just patient, methodical investigation of paper trails and testimony. The slow accumulation of evidence that might, if you're lucky, result in a quiet conviction that makes page 7 of the local newspaper. But here's the thing about quiet work. It matters more than people realise, and sometimes the smallest irregularities point towards something larger, something that would surprise you if you knew what was really happening with those missing Thursday letters. Can you imagine yourself in this moment, standing on that wet street corner, waiting for information that might change nothing, or might unravel everything you thought you understood about your route? Thomas Whelan appears exactly on time, emerging from the fog like a figure in a daguerreotype slowly coming into focus. He's a compact man with a weathered face, the kind of face you get from walking 20 miles a day in all weather, carrying a leather bag that grows heavier with each passing year. His uniform is clean but worn, brass buttons polished despite the late hour, and he carries himself with the particular dignity of someone who takes pride in work that others consider beneath notice. You've met dozens of letter carriers over the years, and you've learned to spot the ones who actually care about the mail, who see their route not as a burden but as a responsibility, a daily promise kept to people they mostly know only by name and address. Whelan is one of those, which is why you're taking his concerns seriously even though, on paper, they sound like nothing at all. He nods at you without speaking, a slight gesture of acknowledgement, and you fall into step beside him, walking north along Market Street toward the sorting facility that serves as the hub for this district's mail distribution. The building looms ahead, a 4-story brick structure with narrow windows that glow yellow in the darkness, and you can hear the muffled sounds of activity inside, the constant sorting and bundling that continues through the night, because mail, like time itself, never really stops moving. Whelan doesn't speak until you're half a block from the building, and when he does, his voice is low, measured, the voice of a man who's spent considerable time thinking about what he's about to say. It started about 6 weeks ago, he tells you, and you notice he's careful not to look directly at you, his eyes fixed on the street ahead. Brennan, my supervisor? He's been staying late every Thursday. Says he's reconciling delivery logs, making sure everything balances before the weekly report goes to the district office. Nothing strange about that, except Brennan's never cared much about paperwork. He's the kind who'd rather let things pile up than spend an extra minute with a ledger. You pull out your notebook, flipping it open to a fresh page, though you don't write anything yet. Sometimes the act of writing makes people nervous, makes them second-guess what they're saying, so you wait. The smell of roasting chestnuts drifts from a street vendor's cart on the corner, mixing with the ever-present coal smoke, and for a moment, you're distracted by the ordinary commerce of city life continuing around you, indifferent to whatever small mystery you're pursuing. Whelan continues, his breath visible in the cooling air. Last Thursday, I came back to drop off some undeliverable letters, things with bad addresses that need to be processed. The building was quiet, most everyone gone for the day, and I saw Brennan in the sorting room with someone I didn't recognize. Civilian clothes, nice coat, the kind of person who doesn't usually have business in a mail facility after hours. They were looking at something together, papers spread out on one of the sorting tables, and when Brennan saw me, he got, not angry exactly, but nervous. Told me the room was closed for inventory, asked me to come back in the morning. But you probably wouldn't notice what happened next if you weren't trained to watch for exactly these kinds of details. To Founts. I left like he asked. Whelan says, but I waited outside, across the street, just watching. About 20 minutes later, the stranger came out carrying a canvas bag, the kind we use for registered mail, and he walked off toward the riverfront. Brennan locked up after him, and here's what got me. Brennan looked around before leaving, actually looked over his shoulder like he was checking if anyone was watching. In 12 years, I've never seen Brennan concerned about who might be watching him do anything. You write now, quickly, capturing the essential details. Thursday evening, unidentified visitor, canvas mailbag, Brennan's unusual caution. The pieces don't form a clear picture yet, but they're starting to suggest the outline of something, the way scattered dots on a page gradually reveal a constellation if you look at them long enough. You ask Whelan if he noticed anything else, any other irregularities in the mail flow, any complaints from customers about missing items. He thinks for a moment, his brow furrowing, and then nods slowly. There's been an uptick in complaints about missing money orders, he says. Not a lot, maybe 5 or 6 over the past month, but that's unusual for our district. Most of them were supposedly sent on Thursdays, and most were heading to addresses in the Western Territories, places where it's hard to verify whether they were actually sent or just never arrived. The Western Territories, that detail catches your attention because mail heading west passes through multiple sorting facilities, creating opportunities for theft or fraud at various points along the chain, and investigations become exponentially more complicated when the mail crosses state lines. You've worked cases where letters disappeared somewhere between Philadelphia and Denver, vanished into that vast network of trains and wagons and temporary sorting tents, and you never recovered them, never even figured out precisely where or how they went missing. The thought that someone might be systematically targeting westbound money orders suggests planning, organization, the kind of operation that requires inside knowledge and careful timing. But who would learn the real truth about what Brennan was actually doing with those Thursday visitors? You thank Whelan for the information, and he nods again, that same economical gesture, before disappearing back into the fog the way he came. Letter carriers, you've learned, have an almost supernatural ability to navigate cities in any weather, their internal maps so precise they could probably walk their routes blindfolded. You stand alone on the street for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of the city settling into its nighttime rhythm, the occasional clip-clop of hooves on cobblestone, the low whistle of a train somewhere beyond the river. Your mind is already sorting through possibilities, arranging and rearranging the facts like pieces of a puzzle that doesn't quite have enough pieces yet to reveal its full picture. The Philadelphia Post Office employs roughly 300 people in various capacities, from clerks and sorters to carriers and supervisors, and Brennan oversees a team of about 20 carriers who work the Northern District routes. He's been with the Postal Service for 9 years, a steady if unremarkable career, the kind of employee who shows up on time, does his job without complaint, and occasionally takes an extra sick day but never enough to attract official scrutiny. You've checked his file earlier in the week, finding nothing particularly notable except a commendation from 1889 for helping resolve a delivery dispute with a local merchant. On paper, he's exactly the kind of dependable mid-level supervisor the Postal Service relies on to keep operations running smoothly. But here's what they don't teach you in training. The most dangerous fraud doesn't come from obvious criminals, It comes from trusted employees who know the system well enough to exploit its weaknesses without triggering immediate alarms. You decide to spend the next few days watching the sorting facility during evening hours, observing the patterns of who comes and goes, who stays late, who meets with whom. Surveillance work is mind-numbingly boring, which is probably why most criminals don't expect it, assuming that postal inspectors are too busy with paperwork to actually stake out a location for hours at a time. You find a position across the street in the recessed doorway of a closed hardware store, a spot that offers a clear view of the facility's main entrance while keeping you mostly hidden in shadow. Thursday won't come for another 5 days, which gives you time to establish what normal looks like before you see what abnormal might reveal. The first evening produces nothing interesting. Employees trickle out between 5 and 6 o'clock, most of them looking tired, a few stopping to light cigarettes or chat briefly before heading toward the streetcar stop. Brennan leaves at 5:30, walking with a slight limp you hadn't noticed before, probably the result of years standing on hard floors. He doesn't look around, doesn't act suspicious, just pulls his coat collar up against the wind and disappears around the corner. You wait another 2 hours, watching the building's windows gradually go dark except for the sorting room on the second floor, where a skeleton crew works through the backlog of mail that arrived on the evening trains. Around 8 o'clock, you give up and head home to your boarding house on Chestnut Street, where your landlady, Mrs. Kowalski, has left a plate of cold chicken and bread covered with a cloth napkin on the kitchen table. The second evening is much the same, and the third. You're starting to wonder if Whelan misinterpreted what he saw, if maybe Brennan's Thursday visitor was perfectly legitimate, a postal inspector from another district, or a contractor discussing delivery routes. This happens sometimes in investigations. You follow a lead that seems promising only to discover it's nothing, just coincidence masquerading as pattern, and you have to decide whether to persist or move on to more productive work. Your supervisor, a humorless man named Davidson who runs the Philadelphia office from a cluttered desk piled with case files and complaint forms, has already asked twice about your progress on the Thursday mail situation, his tone suggesting he considers it a waste of resources that could be better spent on more obvious crimes. Can you feel that particular frustration that comes from knowing something is wrong but not yet being able to prove it? The fourth evening brings rain again, a steady drizzle that turns the street into a mirror reflecting gas lamps and the occasional passing carriage. You're wet and cold, seriously considering abandoning your surveillance for the night, when you notice something that makes you pause. A man approaches the sorting facility from the south, walking quickly despite the rain, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. He's well dressed, definitely not a postal employee, and he glances around before climbing the steps to the entrance. The door, which should be locked to the public after 6 o'clock, opens immediately when he tries it, as if someone inside was expecting him. He disappears into the building, and you note the time in your notebook, 7:45. 20 minutes later, Brennan emerges with the same man, both of them carrying nothing visible, just talking in low voices that don't carry across the wet street. They part ways at the bottom of the steps, Brennan heading north, the visitor heading south, and you have to make a quick decision about who to follow. You choose the visitor because Brennan you can find any time, but this mysterious, well-dressed man might be your only link to understanding what's actually happening. You trail him at a careful distance, staying far enough back that he won't notice but close enough that you won't lose him if he turns a corner. He walks for about 15 minutes, seemingly unconcerned about the rain, and eventually enters a modest hotel near Rittenhouse Square, the kind of place that caters to traveling salesmen and businessmen staying in the city for a few days. You wait outside, debating whether to follow him in, or simply note the location for future reference. The hotel's lobby is visible through a large window, and you can see him speaking briefly with the desk clerk before climbing the stairs to the upper floors. The clerk returns to reading his newspaper, and you realize you're not going to learn anything more tonight unless you're willing to question hotel staff, which would tip your hand and possibly alert the visitor that he's being watched. But I haven't told you the most important part yet about what you discover when you finally check the hotel register 2 days later. Friday morning arrives with weak sunshine that does little to warm the October air, and you find yourself at the main postal inspector's office on Walnut Street, a narrow building squeezed between a tailor's shop and a lithography studio. The office occupies the 3rd floor, accessible by a creaking wooden staircase that announces every visitor long before they reach the top. Inside, the space is cramped and cluttered, 6 desks arranged haphazardly around a central stove that provides barely adequate heat, walls lined with filing cabinets stuffed with case reports dating back to the Civil War. Your colleagues, the other inspectors assigned to the Philadelphia district, are a mix of former police detectives, military veterans, and career postal employees who showed aptitude for investigative work, and they operate with minimal supervision, which suits everyone involved. You spend the morning writing up your observations from the previous evening, trying to make the details sound more significant than they probably are. Unidentified male visitor, approximately 40 years old, well-dressed, entered facility after hours by prior arrangement, departed with Supervisor Brennan, currently residing at the Chestnut Hotel near Rittenhouse Square. On paper, it's not much, barely enough to justify continued surveillance, but something about the timing bothers you. The way the visitor arrived exactly at the moment when the sorting room would be least populated, when only the evening shift supervisor and a handful of clerks would be present to witness his presence. Your desk partner, a former cavalry officer named Warren who lost 2 fingers at Gettysburg and now investigates mail fraud with the same methodical precision he once applied to military logistics, glances over your shoulder at what you're writing. He grunts, which is about as close to commentary as Warren usually gets, and then returns to his own paperwork, something involving a suspected lottery scheme operating through mail-order catalogues. You've learned not to expect much conversation from Warren before noon, his mornings dedicated to silence and coffee strong enough to strip paint. Around 10 o'clock, you decide to visit the Chestnut Hotel, just to see if you can learn anything about your mysterious visitor, without making it obvious you're investigating him. The hotel is a 3-story brick building with a green awning over the entrance, and a small lobby that smells like furniture polish and pipe tobacco. The desk clerk, a thin young man with carefully pomaded hair, looks up from his ledger when you enter, his expression shifting from bored to mildly interested when you show him your postal inspector badge, which is really just a small brass shield that most people find impressively official, even though it carries no actual police authority.
"I'm following up on some irregularities with mail delivery to your guests," you tell him, which is technically true even if it's not exactly the whole truth. "I need to see your register for the past week just to verify some addresses." The clerk hesitates for a moment, probably wondering if he's required to comply with your request, but apparently deciding that cooperation is easier than resistance, he slides the leather-bound register across the desk. You flip back through the pages, scanning names and dates, looking for any entries from Thursday evening. Most of the guests have unremarkable names, the kind you'd expect at a mid-range hotel, businessmen from Baltimore and New York, a family from Boston visiting relatives, a few solo travelers with vague occupations listed as merchant or consultant. Then you find what you're looking for, or rather, what you weren't expecting to find. A guest named Robert Ashford, checked in on Monday, occupation listed as postal contractor, home address listed as Washington, D.C. The timing matches perfectly with your Thursday evening observation, and the occupation raises immediate questions because you're not aware of any legitimate postal contractors who would need to meet privately with a district supervisor after hours. Legitimate contractors deal with the main office during business hours, submitting bids and proposals through official channels, not sneaking into sorting facilities at night. You copy down Ashford's information into your notebook, thanking the clerk with an affability you don't particularly feel, and step back out into the cool morning air. Washington, D.C. That's significant because the Postal Service's headquarters and most of its senior administration operate from Washington, which means if Ashford is actually connected to the Postal Service, you should be able to verify his identity and position through official channels. But if he's claiming to be a postal contractor, and that claim turns out to be false, then you're dealing with something more serious than simple mail theft, possibly a fraud scheme that extends beyond Philadelphia, possibly something involving multiple postal districts. Back at the office, you draft a telegram to the Washington office, keeping it brief and professional. Request verification of postal contractor named Robert Ashford, currently in Philadelphia on business. Please confirm identity and contract details. You send it from the Western Union office 2 blocks away, paying for the telegram from your own pocket because the paperwork required to get reimbursement isn't worth the 3 cents it costs. In your experience, answers to such queries usually take anywhere from a few hours to a few days depending on how busy the Washington office is, which is to say always extremely busy. The afternoon drags on with administrative tasks that can't be postponed, testimony preparation for an upcoming trial involving mail-order fraud, expense reports from last month's travel to Harrisburg, a review of new postal regulations that may or may not affect how you conduct investigations. You've learned that actual detective work constitutes maybe 30% of a postal inspector's job, the rest being documentation, correspondence, and attendance at meetings where nothing particularly useful gets decided. Warren leaves at 4 o'clock to interview a witness in his lottery case, and the office gradually empties as the other inspectors head home or out to evening assignments. You're about to leave yourself when a messenger arrives with a telegram, which is unusual because official responses typically come through regular mail unless something urgent requires immediate communication. You sign for it and tear open the envelope, reading the brief message typed on the familiar yellow paper. No record of postal contractor named Robert Ashford. No current contracts issued to individual or firm by that name. Advise if further investigation required. Edmonds, Chief Inspector, Washington Botsfuck. That's what answers. Well, you probably wouldn't have believed what this meant about everything you thought you understood regarding Thursday mail irregularities. To her.
The telegram changes everything,
transforming what might have been a minor internal matter into something that requires careful planning and probably backup. A man claiming to be a postal contractor who doesn't actually exist, meeting secretly with a district supervisor, potentially connected to missing money orders heading west. These pieces suggest fraud on a scale larger than one person operating alone could manage. You sit at your desk for a long moment, watching the autumn light fade through the dirty windows, thinking through the implications and the various ways this investigation could proceed. Some of them productive, and some of them likely to end with you looking foolish in front of Davidson and the other senior inspectors. The smart move would be to bring Davidson into this immediately, to share what you've discovered and let him decide how to proceed, but you've worked with Davidson long enough to know that he'll want more than circumstantial evidence before authorizing any significant resources. He's not a bad supervisor, just cautious in the way that middle management postal employees tend to be cautious, aware that dramatic investigations that go nowhere reflect poorly on everyone involved, and that his own career advancement depends on maintaining a reputation for sound judgment and minimal scandal. If you go to him now with nothing more than an unidentified visitor and some missing money order complaints, he'll tell you to keep watching and report back when you have something concrete. So you decide to keep watching, but with more focus now, more intention about what you're looking for. Thursday is still 2 days away, and if the pattern Whelan described holds true, that's when Ashford, or whatever his real name is, will likely return to the sorting facility for another meeting with Brennan. You need to see what actually happens during those meetings, what gets discussed or exchanged, whether any mail changes hands or any documents get signed. The problem is that from your position across the street, you can't see into the sorting room windows with enough detail to observe actual activities, just the general movement of figures and the occasional shadow passing in front of the light. What you need is a position inside the building, or at least closer to it, which requires either cooperation from someone already authorized to be there, or a creative interpretation of what postal inspectors are allowed to do in pursuit of an investigation. Technically, you have authority to enter any postal facility at any time to conduct inspections or investigations, but practically, showing up unannounced tends to put people on guard and make them less likely to behave naturally, which defeats the purpose of observation. You consider asking Whelan to let you into the building during his evening delivery returns, but that risks compromising him if Brennan notices an unfamiliar person in areas where they shouldn't be. The solution comes to you while you're walking home that evening, passing by a postal delivery wagon parked outside a corner drugstore. Postal inspectors occasionally conduct what are called efficiency audits, random spot checks of sorting facilities to verify that procedures are being followed correctly and that mail is being processed according to regulations. These audits are supposed to be unannounced, and employees are expected to cooperate fully with inspector requests, including requests to observe operations for extended periods. If you show up Thursday evening claiming to be conducting an efficiency audit, Brennan will have no legitimate reason to refuse you access, and you'll be able to position yourself where you can actually see what happens when Ashford arrives. Can you feel the anticipation building, that particular tension that comes before you commit to a course of action that might expose something important, or might simply reveal that you've been chasing shadows? The next 2 days pass slowly, filled with routine work that feels like distraction from what you're really thinking about. You interview a shopkeeper who claims someone is using the mail to defraud customers by advertising products that don't exist, which turns out to be a misunderstanding about delivery times rather than actual fraud. You review case files from similar investigations in other districts, looking for patterns or techniques that might be relevant to what you're seeing in Philadelphia. You have dinner with Warren at a chop house near the office, and he asks in his taciturn way if you're working on anything interesting, and you tell him maybe, you're not sure yet, and he nods as if this answer makes perfect sense, which it probably does to someone who's spent decades learning that most investigations start with uncertainty and only occasionally end with clarity. Thursday arrives overcast and cold, the kind of day that makes you wish you'd worn an extra layer under your coat. You spend the morning finishing paperwork and the afternoon preparing for your evening efficiency audit, which mostly involves making sure you look official enough that no one will question your presence. Postal inspectors don't wear uniforms, just ordinary business attire with the badge displayed prominently, but there's an art to projecting authority through posture and demeanor, a way of moving through space that suggests you belong wherever you happen to be, and that questioning you would be more trouble than it's worth. You arrive at the sorting facility at 6 o'clock, entering through the main door with your badge held up for the evening clerk to see. He's a young man you don't recognize, probably new to the district, and he barely glances at your credentials before waving you through to the stairs. The building has that particular smell that all postal facilities seem to share, a mixture of paper, ink, leather, and the indefinable scent of thousands of letters passing through every day, each one carrying traces of wherever it came from. The sorting room occupies most of the second floor, a large open space lined with wooden sorting cases, each one divided into dozens of pigeonholes labeled with street names and address ranges. The evening shift is smaller than the day shift, maybe 8 or 9 clerks working steadily through bins of mail that need to be sorted for tomorrow's deliveries. Brennan is standing near the back of the room, checking a delivery log with the kind of concentration that suggests he's either genuinely focused on his work or wants to appear that way. You approach him with your badge still visible, introducing yourself even though you've met him before at various postal functions, and you explain that you're conducting a random efficiency audit of evening operations, nothing to be concerned about, just standard procedure to ensure compliance with postal regulations. Brennan's reaction is what you'd expect from someone with nothing to hide: mild annoyance at the interruption, professional courtesy in his agreement to cooperate, a slight tightening around his eyes that could be stress, or could be normal reaction to unexpected supervision. He offers to answer any questions you have, and you tell him that won't be necessary, you're just here to observe, and you position yourself near the back wall where you can see most of the room while appearing to watch the general sorting process. The clerks barely acknowledge your presence after the first few minutes, returning to their work with the mechanical efficiency of people who've done the same tasks hundreds of times, and could probably sort mail in their sleep. But I haven't told you the most important part yet about who walks through that door at exactly 7:30. Robert Ashford arrives precisely on schedule, entering the sorting room with the confidence of someone who's been here before and knows exactly where he's going. He's wearing the same well-cut coat you saw during your previous surveillance, and up close you can see more details: clean-shaven face, dark hair touched with grey at the temples, eyes that scan the room quickly before settling on Brennan. He doesn't seem surprised or concerned by your presence, which could mean either he doesn't recognize you as a potential threat, or he's good enough at concealing his reactions that your presence doesn't register as problematic. You keep your attention apparently focused on a clerk sorting mail nearby, but your peripheral vision tracks every movement Ashford makes. Brennan greets him with a handshake, nothing unusual in that gesture except for the slight hesitation before Brennan releases his grip, as if he wanted to communicate something through touch that couldn't be said aloud. They exchange a few words you can't hear from your position, and then Brennan leads Ashford toward a small office at the far end of the sorting room, a glass-walled space that supervisors use for administrative work. You watch them enter and close the door, though the glass walls mean you can still see their silhouettes, two figures standing close together, one of them gesturing occasionally while the other appears to be writing something down. You have perhaps 90 seconds to decide what to do next. Following them directly would be too obvious, would reveal that you're not actually here for a routine efficiency audit, but specifically watching them. Staying where you are means you can observe but not hear, can see general actions but not specific details. The compromise you choose is to move slowly along the back wall, pretending to examine the sorting procedures of different clerks, gradually positioning yourself closer to the office while maintaining the appearance of random inspection. The sorting room has good acoustics, sound carrying easily across the open space, which means if Brennan and Ashford raise their voices even slightly, you might be able to catch fragments of conversation. They don't raise their voices, professional criminals rarely do, having learned that discretion is more valuable than clarity when discussing illegal activities in semi-public spaces. But you can see through the glass that Ashford is showing Brennan papers of some kind, documents that look official from a distance, and Brennan is nodding, occasionally pointing at specific sections as if seeking clarification or confirmation. The interaction lasts about 10 minutes, and then Ashford folds the papers carefully and tucks them inside his coat pocket. Brennan says something, Ashford nods, and they shake hands again, this time with less hesitation, more the gesture of business partners concluding a satisfactory transaction. When they emerge from the office, you're examining a sorting case on the opposite side of the room, your back partially turned but your attention completely focused on what happens next. Brennan escorts Ashford to the stairs, and you catch a brief exchange between them, just a few words but enough to raise more questions. Brennan says something about the usual schedule, and Ashford responds with something about westbound routes, and then they're gone, disappearing down the stairwell, and you're left trying to interpret what you've just witnessed. The clerks continue sorting mail, oblivious to or uninterested in the supervisor's visitor, and you realize that if this has been happening regularly every Thursday, it's become normal enough that no one pays attention anymore. That's how most internal fraud works, actually, not through dramatic heists or obvious theft, but through small regular transactions that become invisible through repetition, patterns that hide in plain sight because no one thinks to look for them. You make a show of completing your efficiency audit, thanking Brennan when he returns from escorting Ashford out, noting in your official voice that everything appears to be in order, procedures being followed correctly, no obvious irregularities in the sorting process. Brennan seems relieved, or maybe just tired, and he thanks you for your time with the bland politeness that characterizes most interactions between postal employees and inspectors. You leave through the main entrance, stepping out into the cold evening air, and you walk north for 2 blocks before stopping in another recessed doorway, this one offering a view of the street Ashford would likely take if he's returning to his hotel. Sure enough, about 5 minutes later, You see him walking south, hands in pockets, seemingly unconcerned, just another businessman heading back to his lodgings after an evening meeting. You follow him again, maintaining the same careful distance, and this time you notice details you missed before. His gait is slightly uneven, favoring his left leg just enough to suggest an old injury or chronic pain. He stops once to light a cigarette, the match flaring briefly in the darkness, and you see his face more clearly in that moment. Older than you initially thought, maybe 50, with lines around his eyes that could be from age or stress or both. He resumes walking, and you follow, and eventually he arrives back at the Chestnut Hotel, entering through the front door and heading directly upstairs without stopping at the desk. You wait across the street, watching the hotel's upper windows, trying to determine which room might be his. After about 15 minutes, a light appears in a third-floor window facing the street, and you see Ashford's silhouette moving past the curtain, removing his coat, settling into what you assume is a chair. He appears to be reading something, probably the documents Brennan gave him, and you wish desperately that you had some way to see what those papers contain, what information they hold that's valuable enough to justify weekly secret meetings. But you probably wouldn't imagine what you discover the next morning when you decide to take a significant risk that could either advance the investigation or end your career. Can you picture yourself standing in that cold street, watching a lighted window, knowing that somewhere in that room is evidence of something wrong, but having no legal way to obtain it without revealing your investigation too soon? Friday morning brings a decision that you've been avoiding for the past several days, the kind of decision that separates cautious investigators from effective ones, though sometimes the line between effective and reckless is thinner than anyone likes to admit. You arrive at the office early, before Warren or any of the other inspectors, and you sit at your desk staring at the telegram from Washington that confirmed Ashford doesn't exist, at least not as a postal contractor. The problem you're facing is evidentiary. You've seen suspicious behavior, you've documented irregular meetings, you've confirmed that one party is using a false identity, but you don't have anything concrete enough to make arrests or even to convince Davidson to authorize a full investigation with additional resources. What you need is documentary evidence, something that proves Ashford and Brennan are engaged in actual fraud, rather than just behaving oddly. And that evidence, you're fairly certain, is sitting in Ashford's hotel room, probably in whatever papers he received from Brennan last night. The legal way to obtain those papers would be to get a warrant, which requires convincing a judge that you have probable cause to believe a crime has been committed, which requires more evidence than you currently possess, which creates a circular problem that can only be solved by taking a risk that may or may not be justified by the circumstances. Postal inspectors occupy an interesting legal position, authorized to investigate mail-related crimes but not technically police officers, which means the rules governing search and seizure apply somewhat differently, or at least ambiguously enough that creative interpretation is sometimes possible. If you could establish that Ashford's hotel room contains stolen mail or documents related to mail fraud, you could argue that entering the room falls under your authority to recover postal property and investigate postal crimes. The weakness in this argument is that you don't actually know for certain what's in the room. You're making an educated guess based on circumstantial observation, and educated guesses don't typically hold up well if challenged in court. But here's the thing about investigations. Sometimes you have to act on instinct informed by experience, trusting that the pattern you're seeing is real even if you can't yet prove it definitively. You've been doing this work long enough to recognize when pieces fit together in ways that suggest something larger, when individual irregularities form a coherent picture even if that picture is still slightly out of focus. The question isn't whether Brennan and Ashford are involved in something illegal. You're reasonably certain they are. The question is whether you're willing to take professional and possibly legal risks to prove it. You decide, with the kind of clarity that comes from accepting consequences before they arrive, that you are willing to take those risks. The alternative is to continue passive observation until Ashford leaves Philadelphia, which could be today or next week, and once he's gone you'll have lost your best opportunity to understand what he and Brennan are actually doing with Thursday mail. You write a brief note to Davidson, intentionally vague, saying you're following up on leads related to the Northern District mail irregularities and will report back later today. You leave the note on his desk, and then you walk out of the office before anyone arrives who might ask questions about where you're going. The Chestnut Hotel looks different in morning light, less atmospheric, and more merely functional, a place where people sleep and conduct modest business but don't linger unless they have specific reason to do so. You enter through the front door with your badge visible, and the day clerk, a different person from the one you spoke with previously, glances up with mild interest. You introduce yourself, explaining that you need to examine the room of one of the guests in connection with a mail fraud investigation, and you say this with enough confidence that the clerk doesn't immediately question your authority to make such a request. Which guest? He asks, and you tell him Robert Ashford, 3rd floor, and the clerk flips through the register before nodding. Room 12, is Mr. Ashford expecting you? No, you say, and I'd prefer he not be informed of my visit until after I've completed my examination. This is part of an active investigation, and discretion is important. The clerk hesitates, clearly uncertain about the protocol for this situation, and you can see him weighing whether cooperation or resistance is the path of least trouble. You help him decide by adding, "Of course, if you'd prefer I can return with a federal marshal and make this visit more official, though that tends to attract attention that most hotels find unpleasant for business." He reaches for a key hanging on the board behind the desk, handing it to you with a resigned expression that suggests he's decided cooperation is indeed the path of least trouble. "Please return the key when you're finished," he says, and you assure him you will, and you climb the stairs to the third floor with the key warm in your hand and your heart beating slightly faster than normal, which is what happens when you cross the line between observation and action. But I haven't told you the most important part yet about what you find when you unlock that door and step into Robert Ashford's room. The room is neat, almost compulsively so, with the kind of organization that suggests military training or a personality that finds comfort in order. The bed is made with hospital corners, clothes are hung carefully in the wardrobe, and a small traveling trunk sits at the foot of the bed with its lid closed and locked. A writing desk near the window holds papers arranged in precise stacks, and this is where your attention focuses immediately, because papers are what you came for. Papers that might explain what Brennan and Ashford have been doing every Thursday evening for the past several weeks. You close the door quietly behind you, and move to the desk, listening for any sounds in the hallway that might indicate Ashford's return, though based on your observations he typically leaves the hotel around 9 o'clock, and doesn't return until evening. Still you work quickly, examining the papers without disturbing their arrangement more than necessary. The top stack contains what appear to be routing schedules for westbound mail, official postal documents listing departure times, and connection points for trains carrying mail from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, Chicago, Denver, and points beyond. These documents are marked internal use only, but aren't particularly sensitive. Any postal supervisor would have access to similar information as part of normal operations. The second stack is more interesting. These are handwritten lists, columns of names paired with dollar amounts, ranging from $20 to several hundred, with notations beside each entry indicating dates and what you eventually realize are money order serial numbers. You count quickly. There are perhaps 40 or 50 entries across multiple pages, representing several $1,000s in total, and none of the names are familiar to you, though the dates correspond roughly with the period when Whelan first noticed irregular Thursday meetings. The handwriting is precise, probably Brennan's based on comparison with delivery logs you've seen in the sorting facility, and the sheer careful documentation of these transactions suggests someone who either believes they won't be caught or wants records for their own accounting purposes. The third stack contains correspondence, letters written on plain paper without letterhead or return addresses. You read several of them quickly, trying to extract meaning from the cautious phrasing that criminals use when they're smart enough to avoid explicit incrimination. One letter discusses merchandise arriving as scheduled and distribution proceeding according to plan. Another references the Philadelphia connection proving reliable and expansion to Baltimore routes under consideration. A third mentions percentage arrangements satisfactory to all parties and includes what appears to be a financial breakdown, though the amounts are indicated only by initials and codes you can't immediately decipher. What emerges from these documents is the outline of an organized operation, not just one supervisor stealing occasional money orders, but a network involving multiple people in different cities, systematic theft on a scale that probably extends beyond Philadelphia's northern district to other postal facilities along the westbound mail routes. Ashford, or whatever his real name is, appears to be a coordinator or facilitator, someone who moves between cities arranging the theft and redistribution of money orders, skimming percentages and ensuring that stolen funds get converted to usable currency without triggering obvious red flags in the postal accounting system. You're standing at the desk, holding one of the handwritten lists, when you hear a sound in the hallway that makes your blood run cold. A key turning in a lock, but not this lock, one of the adjacent rooms. You freeze, listening intently, and then you hear footsteps and a door closing, and you release a breath you didn't realize you were holding. The interruption reminds you that you're in a hotel room without legal authorization, examining documents that could be evidence in a federal crime, and if Ashford returns unexpectedly and finds you here, the entire investigation could collapse, possibly taking your career with it. You need to document what you've found but can't simply take the papers. Their disappearance would alert Ashford immediately that someone's discovered his operation. The solution you settle on is copying the most important information into your notebook, working as quickly as accuracy allows, transcribing names and amounts and serial numbers from the handwritten lists, noting key phrases from the correspondence, sketching the general structure of what the documents reveal. Your hand cramps from writing so fast, and you're aware of time passing with an urgency that makes every minute feel compressed. but you force yourself to be thorough because incomplete information might be worse than no information at all. 15 minutes later, you've copied enough material to build a case, assuming you can corroborate what you found with official postal records and testimony from witnesses like Whelan. You carefully rearrange the papers, exactly as they were, comparing their positions to mental snapshots you took before disturbing anything, and then you move toward the door, pausing to survey the room one final time to ensure you haven't left any obvious signs of your presence. The room looks undisturbed, or at least you hope it does, and you step into the hallway, locking the door behind you with hands that are steadier than you expected them to be. The walk down the stairs feels longer than the walk up, each step a small victory against the possibility of discovery, and when you reach the lobby, the day clerk barely glances up as you return the key to him with a polite thank you. You exit onto the street, feeling simultaneously exhilarated and nauseated, the physical response to having done something professionally risky that might prove either brilliant or catastrophically stupid depending on how events unfold from here. The morning sun is brighter now, warming the October air slightly, and you walk back toward the office, trying to organize your thoughts about how to present what you've discovered without admitting exactly how you discovered it. Can you feel that mixture of triumph and anxiety, knowing you found evidence of significant fraud but obtained it through means that may not withstand legal scrutiny if challenged? The office is busy when you return, several inspectors working at their desks, Davidson visible through his office door talking with someone you don't recognize. You sit at your desk and begin writing a formal report, choosing your words carefully, describing your findings in ways that emphasize the pattern of evidence rather than the specific method of discovery. You write that investigation revealed documentation suggesting systematic money order theft involving postal employees in multiple districts, which is accurate without being specific about where or how you saw this documentation. You write that coordination appears to occur through a network of individuals using false identities to facilitate interstate fraud, which is also accurate, and also carefully non-specific about sources. Warren returns from wherever he's been, and settles at his desk with a grunt of acknowledgement in your direction. He sorts through papers on his desk for a moment, then glances over at you with the kind of look that suggests he knows something unusual is happening but isn't sure whether to ask about it. You meet his gaze, and some unspoken communication passes between you. Warren has been investigating fraud long enough to recognize when a colleague has taken calculated risks, and his slight nod suggests approval, or at least understanding, of whatever you've done that you're not discussing openly. But you probably wouldn't have guessed who walks into the office at exactly that moment, interrupting your report and changing the entire trajectory of the investigation. The man who enters is tall, probably 6 feet or slightly more, with silver hair swept back from a high forehead, and the kind of bearing that suggests authority earned through decades rather than simply granted by position. He's wearing a dark suit that's well tailored but not ostentatious, and he carries a leather portfolio under one arm. Davidson emerges from his office immediately, which tells you this visitor is someone important, someone whose arrival requires immediate attention from the senior inspector in the Philadelphia office. They shake hands, exchange brief pleasantries, and then Davidson gestures toward his office, but the visitor says something that makes Davidson turn and look directly at you. "Inspector," Davidson calls out, using the formal address he typically reserves for situations where hierarchy matters, "could you join us for a moment?" You stand, feeling Warren's eyes following you as you cross the office toward Davidson's door, wondering what connection this unknown visitor might have to your investigation, or if perhaps this is about something entirely different, some other case or administrative matter that has nothing to do with Brennan and Ashford and Thursday evening meetings. But instinct, that same instinct that told you to search Ashford's hotel room, suggests this is not coincidental timing, that somehow your investigation is intersected with something larger that you weren't aware of until right now. Davidson's office is small and cluttered, its single window offering a view of the brick wall of the adjacent building, and the three of you arrange yourselves around his desk with the awkward geometry of people who aren't sure yet whether they're collaborators or adversaries. The visitor extends his hand to you, introducing himself in a voice that carries traces of a Boston accent. "James Whitmore, Chief Postal Inspector for the Northeastern Region. I understand you've been looking into irregularities in the Northern District mail operations." The fact that he knows this, knows specifically what you've been investigating, means that someone has been communicating with the regional office about your work, either Davidson reporting through official channels, or someone else with access to information about active investigations. You shake his hand, confirming that yes, you've been following up on reports of missing money orders and unusual patterns in mail handling, trying to gauge from his expression whether this is going to be a conversation about cooperation or interference. Chief inspectors don't typically appear in district offices without reason, and their reasons usually involve either significant problems or significant opportunities, sometimes both at once. Whitmore settles into the chair beside you, opening his portfolio and extracting several documents which he spreads on Davidson's desk. "What I'm about to share with you is confidential," he says, looking at both you and Davidson with the kind of serious expression that precedes information people will wish they didn't know. For the past 6 months, we've been conducting a regional investigation into organized mail fraud operating across multiple states. We've identified a network of individuals, some of them postal employees, who are systematically stealing money orders and converting them through a distribution system that extends from New York to Chicago. He pauses, letting this information settle, and you feel a small shock of recognition as you realize that what you've been investigating in Philadelphia is not an isolated incident but part of something much larger, a fragment of a pattern that extends well beyond your limited view. Whitmore continues, pointing to a map he's extracted from his portfolio, a map marked with cities and connecting lines that form a web across the northeastern and midwestern states. Philadelphia is a critical node in this network, he explains. Money orders stolen in eastern cities get routed through Philadelphia and sent west, where they're cashed by Confederates using forged identifications. The operation requires inside cooperation at multiple facilities, supervisors who can manipulate sorting and routing procedures without triggering immediate suspicion. We've been watching several suspects, including a man calling himself Robert Ashford who appears to coordinate activities between different cities. The mention of Ashford's name confirms what you already suspected, but also raises immediate questions about why you weren't informed earlier that your investigation was running parallel to a larger regional operation. You glance at Davidson, whose expression suggests he's equally surprised by this revelation, which means the regional office has been conducting their investigation independently, possibly with good reasons for maintaining operational security, but also possibly with the kind of territorial thinking that sometimes prevents different law enforcement agencies from sharing information effectively. Whitmore seems to anticipate your unspoken question. We've kept this investigation compartmentalized, he says, because we have reason to believe the network has sources inside postal facilities who alert them to any official inquiries. Every time we've moved too openly, suspects have disappeared or evidence has vanished before we could secure it. What we need now is documentation, hard evidence that connects specific individuals to specific thefts, and that's where your work becomes valuable. He looks at you directly, and you understand that this moment requires careful navigation between honesty and discretion, between revealing what you know and protecting how you learned it. You describe your observations of Brennan and Ashford, the Thursday meetings, the pattern of missing westbound money orders, and Whelan's testimony about suspicious behavior. You mention the efficiency audit you conducted, watching the two men meet in the supervisor's office, and you describe following Ashford back to his hotel. What you don't mention, at least not directly, is entering that hotel room and examining the documents inside, because that admission would complicate everything in ways that might derail the investigation before it can proceed further. But I haven't told you the most important part yet about what Whitmore reveals when he shows you photographs of other suspects in the fraud network.
Whitmore reaches into his portfolio again, this time extracting a folder containing photographs, cabinet cards showing formal portraits of men in various poses, the kind of identification photographs that police departments and federal agencies maintain for tracking criminals and suspects. He spreads 6 photographs across Davidson's desk, tapping each one as he provides brief descriptions of the individuals pictured and their suspected roles in the fraud network. The first photograph shows a middle-aged man with a distinctive scar above his left eyebrow, identified as Charles Emerson, believed to be operating in New York and coordinating theft from the main postal facility in Lower Manhattan. The second photograph is Robert Ashford, or at least the man you've been calling Ashford, though Whitmore identifies him as James Cahill, a former postal employee who was dismissed from service 7 years ago under circumstances involving financial irregularities that were never proven conclusively enough for prosecution. Seeing his face in formal portrait, knowing his real name makes him seem simultaneously more real and more dangerous, transforming him from a mysterious figure glimpsed in shadows to an actual person with a documented history of postal crime. Whitmore explains that Cahill has been moving between cities for the past several years, always staying just ahead of investigations, always careful to avoid actions that would trigger immediate arrest while building relationships with corrupt postal employees who can facilitate his operations. The third photograph shows a woman, which surprises you because you've been assuming this network consists entirely of men, but Whitmore explains that Margaret Sterling operates several mail drop addresses in Chicago where stolen money orders get converted and redistributed. She's been under surveillance for months, though proving her direct involvement has been difficult because she maintains careful distance from the actual theft, positioning herself as merely a business operator who processes financial transactions without questioning their origins too closely. The fourth and fifth photographs show men identified as Thomas Brennan and Howard Calloway, postal supervisors in Pittsburgh and Baltimore respectively, both suspected of providing the kind of inside cooperation that makes systematic theft possible. You're studying these photographs, trying to memorize faces and connect them to the patterns you've been observing in Philadelphia.
When Whitmore places the sixth photograph on the desk and you feel your understanding of the entire investigation shift in a way that's both clarifying and disturbing. The sixth photograph shows Thomas Whalen, the letter carrier who first brought the Thursday irregularities to your attention, the man you've been treating as a concerned witness and potential ally in exposing Brennan's activities. Whalen, Whitmore says quietly, watching your reaction, has been working with Brennan for at least 3 months, possibly longer. We believe he identifies money orders that are particularly valuable or difficult to trace, marks them for theft and ensures they get routed through Brennan's sorting operation when Cahill is in town to collect them. The fact that he approached you suggests either he's nervous about getting caught and trying to establish himself as a cooperative witness, or he's been instructed to monitor your investigation and report back to the network about how much you actually know. The implications of this revelation unfold in your mind like a map being drawn in real time, showing connections and deceptions you didn't see before. Every conversation with Whalen takes on new meaning. Every detail he provided needs to be reconsidered as potential misdirection rather than helpful information. He led you to Brennan, yes, but perhaps in a controlled way that was meant to satisfy your curiosity without revealing the full scope of the operation. He emphasized Thursday meetings but didn't mention his own role in selecting which money orders got stolen. He positioned himself as a concerned employee when actually he was a participant in the fraud, possibly sent to determine whether you were close to discovering something that would require the network to shut down operations temporarily and relocate. Davidson lets out a long breath, a sound of frustration mixed with grudging admiration for the complexity of what they're facing. So we can't trust any information coming from inside the Northern District facility, he says, and Whitmore nods in agreement, adding that this is precisely why the regional investigation has been so difficult, why every attempt to gather evidence has been frustrated by suspects who seem to know when inspectors are watching and adjust their behavior accordingly. What we need, Whitmore says, addressing you directly, is evidence that's solid enough to make arrests but gathered in a way that doesn't alert the network to shut down before we can move against all of them simultaneously. If we arrest Brennan alone, Cahill disappears and the operation simply relocates to another district with different participants. We need to coordinate arrests in multiple cities at once, which requires documentary evidence showing the network's structure and operations. Your observations of the Thursday meetings are useful, but they're not enough by themselves for prosecution. We need more. The unspoken question hanging in the office is whether you have more, whether your investigation has uncovered evidence beyond simple observation, and this is the moment where you need to decide how much to reveal about your unauthorized entry into Ashford's Cahill's hotel room. The information you copied from those documents could be exactly what Whitmore needs to build a comprehensive case against the entire network, but admitting how you obtained that information could invalidate it as evidence, could expose you to disciplinary action, or even criminal charges for illegal search, could compromise the entire investigation if defense attorneys argue that tainted evidence led to all subsequent arrests. You make a decision, one that feels simultaneously necessary and dangerous, and you pull your notebook from your pocket, open it to the pages where you transcribed names and amounts and serial numbers from Cahill's documents. You place the notebook on Davidson's desk and you say, carefully choosing words that are technically accurate without being completely forthcoming, I have reason to believe that Cahill maintains detailed records of the network's operations, including lists of stolen money orders with serial numbers and amounts, correspondence discussing distribution arrangements, and financial breakdowns showing percentage splits among participants. Whitmore picks up your notebook, reading through your transcribed notes with increasing attention, his expression shifting from interest to something approaching satisfaction. He looks up at you, and in his eyes you see the same calculation you performed moments ago, weighing the value of evidence against the complications of how it was obtained, deciding that sometimes investigative success requires accepting information without asking too many questions about its provenance. Can you sense the way institutional knowledge works? The unspoken understanding between experienced investigators that rules sometimes bend under the weight of practical necessity. This is excellent work, Whitmore says finally, and you hear approval in his voice but also a note of careful ambiguity, as if he's chosen not to inquire too closely into your methods because the results are too valuable to reject on procedural grounds. With this information we can cross-reference official postal records, identify specific money orders that were reported missing, build a timeline showing systematic patterns rather than isolated incidents. We can connect Cahill to Brennan, Brennan to Whalen, and all of them to the broader network operating across multiple states. He closes your notebook and hands it back to you, then gathers his photographs and map back into his portfolio with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to managing complex investigations. Here's how we'll proceed, he says, looking at both you and Davidson. I'll coordinate with chief inspectors in New York, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, and Chicago to prepare simultaneous arrests. You'll continue surveillance on Brennan and Cahill here in Philadelphia, but carefully, don't do anything that might alert them that we're moving toward prosecution. Let them think their operation is secure, let them continue their Thursday meetings, and when we move against everyone at once. But you probably wouldn't anticipate what happens 3 days later when everything carefully planned begins to unravel in ways no one expected. Monday morning arrives with frost on the windows, the first real cold snap of autumn, and you're sitting at your desk reviewing postal records for westbound money orders when Warren leans over and mentions in his characteristically brief way that he saw Wayland this morning near the Chestnut Hotel, which is odd because Wayland's delivery route is nowhere near Rittenhouse Square. The observation might mean nothing. People have legitimate reasons for being in parts of the city outside their usual patterns, but given what you now know about Wayland's involvement in the fraud network, any deviation from his normal routine feels potentially significant. You thank Warren for the information, trying to keep your tone casual, not wanting to explain why Wayland's movements matter to you or why the mention of the Chestnut Hotel sends a small spike of concern through your thoughts. If Wayland was meeting with Cahill, it might mean the network has become nervous, might mean they're discussing whether to shut down operations temporarily, might mean someone has noticed your investigation despite your attempts at discretion. The timing is particularly bad because Whitmore needs another week to coordinate with inspectors in other cities to ensure that arrests happen simultaneously so that no one in the network has time to warn others or destroy evidence. You decide to walk past the Chestnut Hotel during your lunch break, just to see if there's any unusual activity, any indication that Cahill might be preparing to leave Philadelphia earlier than his normal Thursday departure. The hotel looks exactly as it always does, ordinary and unremarkable, and the desk clerk nods politely when you enter but shows no sign of recognizing you from your previous visits. You approach casually, asking if Mr. Ashford is available, and the clerk checks his register before informing you that Mr. Ashford checked out yesterday evening, settling his account and leaving no forwarding address. The news hits you like cold water, shocking and clarifying at once. Cahill has left Philadelphia 3 days before his usual Thursday departure, which almost certainly means someone warned him, someone told him that his operation was under investigation, and that he needed to relocate immediately. The most obvious candidate for that someone is Wayland, which would explain his presence near the hotel this morning. He was checking to verify that Cahill had actually left, or perhaps collecting final instructions about how to proceed now that the network's Philadelphia operations are compromised. You return to the office quickly, finding Davidson in his usual position behind his cluttered desk, and you explain what you've learned about Cahill's sudden departure. Davidson's expression shifts from attention to concern to carefully suppressed anger, the kind of anger that comes from knowing that careful planning has been disrupted by factors outside your control. He reaches for his telephone, one of the new devices that have recently been installed in federal offices, and he places a call to Whitmore's office in New York, speaking in clipped tones that convey urgency without providing details that might be overheard by telephone operators who sometimes listen to conversations out of boredom or worse motives. Whitmore arrives in Philadelphia by evening train, looking tired and frustrated, and the three of you meet again in Davidson's office after the other inspectors have gone home for the day. The situation he describes is worse than you feared. Cahill's departure from Philadelphia appears to be part of a coordinated withdrawal. Suspects in Baltimore and Pittsburgh have also disappeared in the past 48 hours, checking out of hotels or simply vanishing from their usual locations without notice. The network has somehow learned that a regional investigation is underway, and they're shutting down operations, dispersing to avoid arrest, probably planning to reconvene in different cities under different names once they believe the immediate danger has passed. We still have Brennan and Whalen, you point out, and if we arrest them now, we might be able to leverage their testimony against the others, offer them reduced charges in exchange for cooperation in locating Cahill and the rest of the network. Whitmore considers this, rubbing his eyes with the weariness of someone who spent too many hours on trains and in telegraph offices trying to coordinate a collapsing operation. It's a reasonable approach, he says finally, but we need to move quickly, before Brennan and Whalen realize that Cahill has left town and decide to disappear themselves. We'll make arrests tomorrow morning, early, catch them at home before they can react or destroy evidence. The plan is simple in outline but complicated in execution, requiring coordination with local police who will provide backup in case arrests meet resistance, requiring preparation of arrest warrants based on evidence you've gathered, requiring careful timing to ensure that both Brennan and Whalen are taken into custody simultaneously so that neither can warn the other. You spend the evening drafting affidavits, documenting everything you've observed about Thursday meetings and suspicious patterns, carefully omitting any mention of unauthorized hotel room searches while emphasizing information obtained through legitimate surveillance and witness interviews. But I haven't told you the most important part yet about what you discover when you arrive at Brennan's residence at 6 o'clock the following morning. Brennan lives in a modest row house in Kensington, a neighborhood of narrow streets and brick buildings where factory workers and lower-level clerks and supervisors maintain respectable if not prosperous households. Dawn is just breaking when you arrive with Davidson and 2 Philadelphia police officers, the sky turning from black to deep blue, the air sharp with cold that makes your breath visible. The street is quiet, most residents still sleeping, though you can see lights beginning to appear in a few windows as early risers prepare for work. You approach Brennan's door with the kind of careful attention that arrests always require, aware that even apparently cooperative subjects can become dangerous when confronted with evidence of their crimes. Davidson knocks firmly, the sound echoing in the early morning stillness, and you wait, listening for movement inside the house. There's nothing at first, just silence, and Davidson knocks again, louder this time, calling out Brennan's name and identifying himself as a postal inspector. More silence, and then you hear something that makes your stomach tighten, a sound like furniture moving, something heavy being dragged across a floor, the kind of sound people make when they're trying to escape or destroy evidence or prepare for confrontation. One of the police officers moves to the back of the house, checking for rear exits, while the other positions himself beside the front door with his hand resting on his service revolver. Davidson knocks a third time, his voice carrying more authority now, stating clearly that he has a warrant for Brennan's arrest, and that obstruction will result in additional charges. The sounds inside the house stop, replaced by footsteps approaching the door, and then the door opens to reveal Brennan standing in his nightshirt, hair disheveled, eyes red and unfocused in a way that suggests either interrupted sleep or something more concerning. "What's this about?" he asks, though his tone lacks conviction, and you can see in his face that he already knows, that he's been expecting this moment or something like it, that the appearance of postal inspectors at his door confirms fears he's been carrying for days or weeks. Davidson presents the arrest warrant, explaining the charges formally: theft of postal property, conspiracy to commit mail fraud, obstruction of postal operations, and Brennan listens without protest, his shoulders sagging slightly as if the weight of maintained deception has suddenly become too heavy to carry any longer. You enter the house with Davidson while the police officers remain outside, following Brennan as he asks permission to dress before being taken into custody. His bedroom is on the second floor, small and sparsely furnished, and while he's pulling on clothes you notice a writing desk near the window, papers scattered across its surface in a way that suggests they were being reviewed recently, possibly during the night when normal people are sleeping but guilty people are lying awake worrying about consequences. With Brennan's permission, grudgingly given, you examine these papers and find exactly what you hoped for, and simultaneously dreaded, correspondence between Brennan and Cahill, written in the careful language of people who know they're committing crimes but want to maintain plausible deniability if their words are ever examined by authorities. One letter discusses inventory adjustments and irregular deliveries, phrases that sound innocuous but clearly refer to stolen money orders and their redistribution through the network. Another letter mentions specific dollar amounts and percentages, Brennan's share of the proceeds from various thefts over the past several months. A third letter, dated just 5 days ago, contains a passage that makes you pause and read carefully. Given recent complications, suggests temporary cessation of regular arrangements. Will resume contact when circumstances improve. The phrase recent complications almost certainly refers to your investigation, which means Cahill knew days ago that something was wrong, knew that postal inspectors were getting close to discovering the network's operations, and sent word to Brennan to prepare for possible shutdown. The question is how Cahill learned about your investigation, and the most obvious answer remains Whalen, reporting back to his confederates about every conversation you had with him, every question you asked, every observation you made. You've been investigating a fraud network that was simultaneously investigating you, monitoring your progress and adjusting their operations accordingly, and they would have succeeded in escaping if Cahill hadn't left town slightly too early, if you hadn't noticed his departure and moved to make arrests before the entire network could disperse. Brennan finishes dressing and turns to face you with an expression that's difficult to read, part resignation, part relief, part calculation about what happens next. "I'd like to speak with a lawyer before answering any questions," he says, which is his right and exactly what you expected, though you notice he doesn't claim innocence or protest the arrest or do any of the things that truly innocent people often do when confronted with accusations they don't understand. His guilt is evident in his silence, in the way he doesn't ask what evidence you have or how you discovered his activities, because he already knows what you must have found. The arrest proceeds smoothly, Brennan cooperative if not talkative, and by 7 o'clock he's in custody at the federal building downtown, placed in a holding cell while Davidson begins the process of formal charging and arraignment. You leave to assist with Whalen's arrest, which is happening simultaneously at his residence in Frankfurt, another neighborhood of row houses and working families, another early morning knock on a door that will change someone's life irrevocably. The police officers who conducted that arrest report that Whalen resisted briefly, trying to run out his back door before being tackled in the alley behind his house, and that he had a bag packed with clothes and money, clear evidence that he was preparing to flee Philadelphia once he confirmed that Cahill had safely departed. Can you imagine the strange mixture of satisfaction and disappointment that comes from making successful arrests while knowing that the most important suspects have already escaped? By mid-morning, both Brennan and Whalen are in federal custody, both have requested lawyers, and both are maintaining silence about the broader network they were involved with. This is standard procedure for criminals who hope that cooperation might earn them reduced sentences but want to negotiate terms before providing information that might incriminate themselves further. Davidson and Whitmore begin the delicate process of determining which suspect is more likely to cooperate, which one has more to lose from prosecution, and more to gain from testimony, which one can be convinced that his best option is turning witness against his former Confederates. The answer, somewhat surprisingly, turns out to be Whalen. By afternoon, his lawyer has negotiated a preliminary agreement. Whalen will provide detailed testimony about the network's operations in exchange for consideration of reduced charges, possibly avoiding federal prison if his cooperation leads to the arrest and conviction of higher-level participants like Cahill. The testimony he provides over the next several hours, recorded by a court stenographer in Davidson's office, fills in gaps you hadn't even known existed in your understanding of the fraud scheme. Whalen explains that he was recruited into the network 18 months ago, not by Brennan but by another letter carrier who has since left Postal Service and disappeared into the Western Territories. The recruitment was gradual, starting with small favors, misdelivering certain letters to wrong addresses, delaying delivery of time-sensitive mail, before progressing to more serious crimes like identifying valuable money orders and ensuring they passed through Brennan's sorting operation at times when theft would be difficult to detect. Whalen received a percentage of stolen funds, usually about 15%, which supplemented his postal salary enough to matter but not so much that sudden prosperity would attract attention from neighbors or colleagues. But you probably wouldn't believe what Whalen reveals about how the network identified which money orders to steal, and how they avoided detection for so long. Whalen's testimony unfolds methodically, each detail adding layers to your understanding of how sophisticated the fraud network actually was. He explains that the network didn't steal randomly but rather targeted money orders based on specific criteria designed to minimize risk of detection. They avoided money orders sent to or from major banks and financial institutions, which maintain careful records and quickly notice discrepancies. They avoided amounts over $500 which require additional documentation and verification. Instead, they focused on money orders between $20 and $200 sent to individuals in Western Territories, amounts large enough to be worthwhile but small enough that missing payments might be attributed to mail delays or errors rather than theft. The selection process involved multiple participants reviewing delivery logs and sorting records to identify promising targets. Whalen would note money orders passing through his route that met the criteria, marking their envelopes with tiny pencil dots that appeared accidental but actually signaled to Brennan which items should be diverted during the Thursday evening sorting operations. Brennan would then hold these marked money orders until Cahill's weekly visit, when they would be handed over in exchange for cash payments representing Brennan's share of the theft. Cahill would take the stolen money orders to Chicago, where Margaret Sterling operated a small financial services business that cashed money orders with minimal questions, using forged identifications and falsified documentation to make the transactions appear legitimate. The reason the network avoided detection for so long was their patience and discipline. They limited thefts to perhaps 10 or 15 money orders per week across multiple postal districts, spreading the losses thinly enough that no single facility showed obvious patterns of missing mail. Victims who complained about money orders that never arrived were typically told that mail sometimes gets lost or delayed, and they were encouraged to file claims with the Postal Service's Dead Letter Office, which processed thousands of such claims annually and couldn't possibly investigate each one thoroughly. Most victims eventually received replacement money orders or refunds, which satisfied them even though it meant the Postal Service was absorbing losses that were actually caused by internal theft. What Whalen describes is essentially a tax on the postal system, systematic skimming that stayed just below the threshold where alarm would be triggered, carefully calibrated to exploit the gap between individual complaints and systemic investigation. The network understood that postal inspectors respond to patterns, to concentrations of theft that suggest organized crime, so they deliberately prevented patterns from forming by dispersing their operations geographically and temporally, never stealing too much from any one location or during any particular time period. You listen to this testimony with a mixture of professional admiration for the network's sophistication and frustration at how long they operated without detection despite multiple inspectors working in affected districts. The truth is that until you started watching Brennan's Thursday meetings, no one had connected the various complaints and irregularities into a coherent picture of organized fraud. Individual postal supervisors noticed occasional missing money orders but attributed them to normal operational losses. Individual inspectors investigated specific complaints but didn't have access to data from other districts that might have revealed broader patterns. The network exploited these institutional blind spots, counting on bureaucratic fragmentation to protect them from discovery. Whalen's cooperation also provides information about other participants you weren't previously aware of. He names letter carriers in Baltimore and Pittsburgh who performed roles similar to his, identifying valuable money orders and marking them for theft. He describes a postal clerk in Chicago who worked with Margaret Sterling to process stolen money orders through her financial services business, providing inside knowledge about postal verification procedures that helped Sterling avoid detection. He mentions a former postal inspector in New York who provided the network with information about ongoing investigations, essentially selling out his colleagues in his agency for a percentage of stolen funds, which represents a betrayal so profound that even hardened criminals would consider it contemptible. The testimony continues through the afternoon and into evening. Wayland's voice growing hoarse from talking, the stenographer's fingers cramping from hours of transcription, and gradually a complete picture emerges of the fraud network's structure and operations. It's more extensive than Whitmore initially believed, involving perhaps 20 or 30 active participants across 6 states, with total thefts probably exceeding $50,000 over the past 2 years, which is a staggering amount when you consider that the average postal worker earns less than $1,000 annually. But I haven't told you the most important part yet, about the one piece of information Wayland provides that changes everything you thought you understood about Cahill's role in the network. Near the end of his testimony, after hours of detailed descriptions about theft procedures and distribution methods, Wayland mentions almost casually that Cahill wasn't actually the network's organizer or primary coordinator. He was, according to Wayland, essentially a courier and facilitator, someone who traveled between cities collecting stolen money orders and delivering cash payments, but who took orders from someone else, someone Wayland never met personally but heard referenced occasionally in conversations with Brennan. This person, referred to only as the director in the few written communications Wayland saw, apparently designed the network's operating procedures, determined which postal districts to target, and made strategic decisions about when to expand operations and when to shut them down temporarily to avoid detection. This revelation fundamentally changes the nature of the investigation, because it means that even if you eventually locate and arrest Cahill and all the other participants Wayland has identified, the network's leadership remains unknown and potentially capable of rebuilding operations with new recruits in different locations. The director, whoever he or she might be, has managed to insulate themselves from direct contact with most network participants, communicating through intermediaries and written instructions that rarely include identifying information. The sophistication of this arrangement suggests someone with extensive knowledge of postal operations and law enforcement techniques, possibly a current or former postal employee at a senior level, possibly someone with connections to criminal organizations that operate across multiple jurisdictions. Whitmore looks troubled by this information, recognizing that it transforms what he thought was a nearly completed investigation into something more complex and potentially longer lasting. He asks Wayland if he has any information at all about the director's identity, physical description, location, anything that might help narrow down potential suspects, but Wayland can only provide vague details gleaned from overheard conversations and fragmentary remarks. The director is apparently based somewhere in the Midwest, possibly Chicago or St. Louis, and has connections to financial institutions that facilitate the conversion of stolen money orders into usable currency. Beyond these sparse details, Wayland knows nothing, and he seems genuinely regretful about this limitation, understanding that his cooperation is less valuable if it can't lead investigators to the network's actual leadership. The session concludes around 8 o'clock in the evening, everyone exhausted from the day's intensity, and Wayland is returned to his cell while his attorney negotiates the formal terms of his cooperation agreement. You and Davidson and Whitmore remain in the office, drinking coffee that's gone cold and bitter, discussing what to do with the information you've gathered. The immediate priority is locating Cahill, who has at least a 3-day head start and could be anywhere in the country by now, though Wayland's testimony suggests he typically operates in a circuit between Philadelphia, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Chicago, and occasionally St. Louis, which narrows the search area somewhat. Whitmore dispatches telegrams to chief postal inspectors in each of those cities, providing Cahill's description and known aliases, requesting surveillance of postal facilities and hotels where he's previously stayed, warning that he should be considered aware that he's being sought, and therefore likely to be cautious about his movements and contacts. The responses that arrive over the next several days are uniformly disappointing. No one has seen Cahill, no one has any information about his current location, and the network's other participants who are under surveillance have similarly disappeared, suggesting a coordinated withdrawal that was planned in advance and executed with the kind of discipline that makes detection difficult. You spend the following week reviewing postal records from multiple districts, looking for patterns that might indicate where the network has relocated its operations, or whether they've suspended activities entirely while waiting for investigative pressure to diminish. The work is tedious, involving comparison of thousands of money order transactions against complaint logs and missing mail reports, looking for statistical anomalies that might suggest systematic theft rather than random operational losses. Warren assists with this analysis, applying his methodical approach to the data in ways that gradually reveal subtle patterns you might have missed on your own. What emerges from this analysis is a disturbing realization that the network's theft operations have indeed continued even after Cahill's departure from Philadelphia, though at reduced levels and in different locations than before. There's an uptick in missing money order complaints from postal districts in western Pennsylvania and Ohio, areas that weren't previously showing suspicious patterns, which suggests the network has shifted its geographic focus rather than shutting down entirely. The amounts and timing of these new thefts match the network's previous operational methods closely enough that coincidence seems unlikely, which means either Cahill has resumed coordination from a new location, or the director has installed new facilitators to maintain operations while primary suspects remain under investigation. Davidson wants to send you to Pittsburgh to investigate these new patterns directly, to determine whether the network has actually relocated there, or whether the complaints represent unrelated operational problems that happen to resemble organized fraud. Whitmore agrees this would be useful, but cautions that if the network is watching for postal inspector activity, your appearance in a new district might trigger another relocation, playing an endless game of geographic whack-a-mole, where criminals stay one step ahead by dispersing whenever investigators get close. Can you feel the frustration inherent in investigating crimes where the criminals are intelligent and organized, where every move you make might be anticipated and countered, where success requires not just finding evidence but outmaneuvering adversaries who are actively working to avoid detection? The Pittsburgh assignment is scheduled for the following Monday, giving you a few days to prepare and to wrap up remaining work in Philadelphia. Brennan has also negotiated a cooperation agreement, though his testimony adds relatively little to what Whalen already provided, mostly confirming details and providing slightly more information about Cahill's habits and preferences during his Thursday visits. Brennan seems genuinely remorseful about his involvement in the fraud, claiming that financial pressures from medical bills for his wife's chronic illness pushed him into accepting Cahill's initial recruitment offer, and that once he started stealing he felt unable to stop because the network threatened to expose him if he tried to withdraw. Whether this explanation is truthful, or merely a strategy to generate sympathy during sentencing is difficult to determine, though his cooperation does suggest he's genuinely trying to make amends for his crimes. On Friday afternoon, as you're preparing files to take with you to Pittsburgh, a telegram arrives that changes the entire trajectory of the investigation once again. The message is from a postal inspector in St. Louis named Harrison, brief and urgent. Have located subject matching description of James Cahill, currently under surveillance at Commercial Hotel, awaiting instructions for arrest. Advise immediately. The news spreads quickly through the office, generating the kind of controlled excitement that comes from knowing that months of frustrating work might finally produce concrete results. Whitmore is contacted immediately, and he authorizes Harrison to maintain surveillance but not to make an arrest yet, wanting to ensure that when they take Cahill into custody they also secure any documents or evidence he might have with him, and wanting to coordinate the timing with other actions against network participants if possible. But you probably wouldn't expect what happens when Harrison's next telegram arrives 3 hours later with news that makes everyone realize how precarious the situation actually is. The train lurches to an unexpected halt somewhere between Harrisburg and Lancaster, the kind of abrupt stop that sends passengers swaying against their seats and generates immediate speculation about what might have caused the delay. You're reviewing case notes with Warren, trying to organize the evidence you've gathered in Pittsburgh into a coherent narrative for the prosecution reports you'll need to write, when a conductor appears in your compartment asking if there's a postal inspector named Mitchell aboard. You identify yourself, and he hands you a telegram that was delivered to the station master at this small junction with instructions to find you on the eastbound express. The telegram is from Whitmore, and its urgency is evident in the abbreviated phrasing. Cincinnati inspectors located Voss, arrested without incident, in custody with full cooperation, claims director identity mistaken, says he works for actual director, requires immediate questioning. Can you divert to Cincinnati before returning Philadelphia? You read the message twice, trying to parse what claims director identity mistaken actually means. The most obvious interpretation is that Edmund Voss, faced with arrest and prosecution, is attempting to bargain his way to a reduced sentence by offering to identify someone higher in the network's hierarchy, claiming that he's not the mastermind you believed him to be but rather another facilitator taking orders from someone else. This would be a standard criminal defense strategy except that Whalen's testimony specifically identified a mysterious director, and Cahill's information apparently pointed to Voss as that person, which creates confusion about who's telling the truth and what the network's actual structure might be. Warren looks at you with a question in his expression, and you make a quick decision based on the principle that sometimes investigations require flexibility over rigid planning. We're going to Cincinnati, you tell him, and then you inform the conductor that you need to disembark at the next junction where you can catch a westbound connection. The conductor seems unsurprised by this request, apparently accustomed to federal officials changing travel plans abruptly, and he promises to notify you when the train reaches the junction in about 40 minutes. The connection to Cincinnati involves a 3-hour wait at a small station, and then an overnight journey on a train that stops at what feels like every town between central Pennsylvania and the Ohio border. You doze fitfully in your seat, waking periodically to check the time or review your notes, and Warren sleeps with the enviable stillness of someone whose military experience taught him to rest whenever opportunity permits. Dawn is breaking when the train finally pulls into Cincinnati's Union Terminal, a grand building with arched windows that catch the early light and make the limestone facade glow softly against the grey morning sky. Whitmore is waiting on the platform, looking exhausted but alert, and he greets you with the kind of brief handshake that conveys urgency without wasting time on pleasantries. Voss is being held at the federal building, he explains as you walk quickly through the terminal. He's been cooperative since his arrest, almost eager to talk, which is unusual enough that I wanted you here before we proceed with detailed questioning. Sometimes people who are too cooperative are actually misdirecting, trying to control the narrative in ways that serve their interests rather than revealing truth. The federal building is a short carriage ride from the terminal, and during that journey Whitmore provides more context about Voss's arrest. Cincinnati inspectors located him at a boarding house near the river, registered under his own name without any apparent attempt to conceal his identity, which seemed odd for someone supposedly fleeing law enforcement. When confronted, he surrendered immediately and asked to speak with the senior inspector in charge of the mail fraud investigation, saying he had information that would be valuable to the prosecution in exchange for consideration during sentencing. The interrogation room in Cincinnati's federal building is small and stuffy, with a single window that provides inadequate ventilation, and a wooden table scarred from years of use. Edmund Voss sits on one side of this table, his hands folded calmly in front of him, looking remarkably composed for someone facing federal prosecution and possible prison time. Up close, he's older than he appeared during your brief observation in Pittsburgh, probably close to 60, with deep lines around his eyes and silver hair that's thinning at the crown. His clothes are well maintained, but not expensive, the wardrobe of someone who once held professional status, but has since fallen to more modest circumstances. You and Whitmore sit across from him while Warren positions himself near the door, notebook ready to record the conversation. A court stenographer is also present, seated at a small desk in the corner, fingers poised over her typing machine. Whitmore begins with standard questions establishing Voss's identity and background, confirming his employment history with the Postal Service, his dismissal in 1889, his activities in the years since, and Voss answers each question directly, without evasion or apparent attempt to minimize his involvement in illegal activities. I coordinated theft operations in Pittsburgh, Baltimore, and briefly in Philadelphia before that location became compromised, Voss says, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone reciting facts rather than confessing crimes. I recruited supervisors like Brennan and Griggs, provided them with operational procedures, collected stolen money orders and delivered them to Chicago for conversion through Sterling's business. I received a percentage of proceeds, typically 20%, which sustained me comfortably enough to continue the work. Whitmore leans forward slightly. But you're claiming you're not the director, not the person who designed and controls this network. That's correct, Voss says, and now his tone shifts to something more urgent, as if he's been waiting for this question and prepared his answer carefully. The director recruited me 4 years ago when I was struggling financially after my dismissal from Postal Service. He knew about my circumstances, knew I had inside knowledge of postal operations, and he offered me an opportunity to earn substantial income by coordinating theft operations in northeastern cities. I never met him in person. All instructions came through written correspondence delivered by various couriers. Payments were made through bank transfers that concealed his identity. You interrupt, asking the obvious question. If you never met this person, how do you know the director exists at all? How do you know you're not simply taking orders from Cahill or Sterling or someone else in the network you've already identified? Voss shakes his head. Cahill and Sterling are facilitators like me, each handling specific aspects of the operation, but none of us controlling its overall design. The director makes strategic decisions about which cities to target, when to expand operations, when to shut down compromised locations. The correspondence I received contained information about postal procedures and investigative techniques that could only come from someone with high-level access to federal postal administration, possibly someone currently employed in a senior position. This claim, if true, represents a significant escalation of the investigation's implications. A fraud network coordinated by former employees and criminal facilitators is serious but relatively containable. A fraud network controlled by someone currently holding a senior position in federal postal service suggests corruption at a level that could undermine confidence in the entire postal system and require investigation of officials who should be above suspicion. Whitmore asks, do you have any evidence supporting this claim? Any correspondence from this director that might help identify him? I destroyed most correspondence as instructed, Voss says, but I kept one letter, insurance against the possibility that I might someday need to bargain for leniency. It's hidden in my sister's residence in Pittsburgh, sewn into the lining of a trunk in her attic. The letter contains enough detail about internal postal procedures and upcoming policy changes that it should help you identify someone with access to confidential administrative information. The interrogation continues for another 2 hours, Voss providing detailed information about the network's operations, while carefully positioning himself as merely a coordinator, rather than the architect of the fraud scheme. Some of his information corroborates what you already know from Whelan and Brennan's testimony, while other details are new and potentially valuable for prosecution. Whether his claim about a higher-level director is truthful, or merely a strategy to reduce his own culpability, remains unclear, but the possibility is troubling enough that it requires investigation, regardless of Voss's motives for raising it. But I haven't told you the most important part yet about what happens when inspectors retrieve the hidden letter from Mary Voss's residence and discover the identity of the person Edmund Voss claims is the actual director of the fraud network. The letter arrives in Cincinnati by special courier 2 days after Voss provides instructions for its retrieval, delivered in a sealed envelope that multiple inspectors have signed across the closure to maintain chain of custody and prevent any accusations of tampering. Whitmore opens it carefully in your presence, extracting a single sheet of high-quality paper covered in neat handwriting, the kind of precise script that suggests someone accustomed to official correspondence and formal documentation. You lean forward to read it simultaneously with Whitmore, and the opening line makes both of you pause in recognition of what you're seeing. The Philadelphia complications require immediate response. Inspector Davidson has authorized expanded investigation of Northern District irregularities, which places our arrangements at unacceptable risk. Recommend cessation of Thursday collections until situation resolves. Will advise when operations can resume safely. Destroy this correspondence after reading BHAE. The signature initials mean nothing to you initially, but Whitmore's expression has shifted to something between shock and carefully controlled anger, and he says quietly, "James Edmonds, Chief Postal Inspector for the Washington office. My direct supervisor." The implications unfold in your mind like a map revealing territory you didn't know existed. Edmonds oversees all regional postal inspection operations, coordinates investigations across multiple districts, has access to every case report and investigative update that flows through the federal postal system. He would know about your Philadelphia investigation before you even filed formal reports, would know about Whitmore's regional fraud inquiry, would know about arrests in St. Louis and Pittsburgh, and could warn network participants to scatter before inspectors could coordinate simultaneous actions. His position provides not just information but also authority to redirect investigations, to discourage certain lines of inquiry, to ensure that cases develop in ways that protect his fraud network, while appearing to pursue legitimate law enforcement objectives. The letter's reference to Davidson authorizing expanded investigation is particularly disturbing, because it reveals that Edmonds was monitoring your work closely enough to know about internal discussions at the Philadelphia district office, possibly reading Davidson's reports before they were even transmitted to Washington, certainly using his administrative access to track investigative progress in real time. Every telegram Whitmore sent to Washington, every request for resources or coordination with other districts, would have passed across Edmonds' desk, giving him perfect visibility into the investigation that was supposedly targeting his network. Warren, who has been reading the letter over your shoulder, asks the question that's forming in your own mind. How many investigations has Edmonds redirected or shut down over the years? How many inspectors have gotten close to discovering the network only to be reassigned or told their evidence wasn't sufficient for prosecution? Whitmore doesn't answer immediately, and you can see him mentally reviewing years of cases, wondering which failures might have been legitimate dead ends, and which were deliberately sabotaged by someone with authority to control investigative outcomes. The paranoia that comes from discovering betrayal at high levels affects everyone in the room, creating suspicion about whether other senior officials might also be compromised, whether the corruption extends beyond Edmonds to others in Washington or regional offices. "We need to move carefully," Whitmore says finally. "If we simply arrest Edmonds based on this letter, he'll claim it's forged, that Voss created it to deflect blame, that we have no corroborating evidence beyond the word of admitted criminals. We need more documentation showing that Edmonds had knowledge he shouldn't have possessed, financial records proving he received payments from the network, testimony from multiple sources that establishes a pattern of suspicious behavior. You suggest reviewing Edmonds' financial records, looking for unexplained income or assets that exceed what a chief inspector's salary could support. But Whitmore points out that Edmonds has been with the Postal Service for 23 years, and likely accumulated legitimate savings over that time. Any unusual wealth could be explained away as inheritance or investment returns, and without clear proof of criminal proceeds, financial investigation alone won't be sufficient for prosecution. Can you sense the frustration of finally understanding the full scope of the network's operations while simultaneously recognizing how difficult it will be to prove corruption at this level? Yeah. The solution eventually comes from an unexpected source. Margaret Sterling, facing prosecution in St. Louis and apparently deciding that cooperation offers her best chance at reduced sentencing, requests to speak with Whitmore about information she possesses regarding the network's financial operations. She's been in custody for nearly 2 weeks, long enough to consider her options thoroughly, and her lawyer has negotiated a preliminary agreement that grants her immunity from certain charges in exchange for complete truthful testimony about network participants and procedures. Sterling's testimony, delivered over 3 days in a St. Louis federal building with court stenographers recording every word, provides the financial documentation that Edmonds' letter alone couldn't supply. She explains that her Chicago financial services business processed stolen money orders through a complex system of accounts and transfers designed to obscure the money's origins, converting postal instruments into currency that could be distributed to network participants without triggering banking regulations or postal audits. Each participant received payments through coded wire transfers that appeared to be legitimate business transactions, consulting fees, commission payments, investment returns, but actually represented their share of stolen proceeds. Sterling maintained detailed ledgers of these transactions, not for tax purposes obviously, but rather for internal accounting to ensure that participants received correct percentages and that disputes over payment distribution could be resolved by reference to documented records. These ledgers, which she kept hidden in a safe deposit box under a false name, list payments made over a 4-year period to various individuals identified only by initials and coded designations. One set of entries, marked JEC Primary, shows quarterly payments ranging from $1,500 to $3,000, totaling more than $25,000 over 4 years, an amount that vastly exceeds what any legitimate consulting arrangement would generate. Sterling identifies JEC Primary as James Edmonds, based on conversations with Cahill, who occasionally mentioned receiving instructions from the chief and made references to Washington connections that protected the network from serious investigation. She can't provide direct evidence that she ever met or communicated with Edmonds personally, but the payment patterns in her ledgers correlate with periods when various investigations were mysteriously shut down or redirected, and the amounts increased during times when the network expanded operations into new cities, suggesting that Edmonds received bonuses for successfully protecting expanding criminal activities. Armed with this testimony in Sterling's ledgers, Whitmore coordinates with the Justice Department rather than pursuing the matter through Postal Service channels, recognizing that Edmonds' position gives him too much influence over internal investigations. Federal prosecutors in Washington prepare arrest warrants and coordinate with U.S. Marshals to take Edmonds into custody at his office, timing the arrest to occur simultaneously with raids on his residence and several locations where he maintains bank accounts. The operation happens on a Tuesday morning, quiet and efficient. Federal agents entering the chief postal inspector's office and placing him under arrest for conspiracy to commit mail fraud, accepting bribes, and obstruction of federal investigations. Edmonds maintains his composure during the arrest, showing none of the panic or protest that might indicate innocence wrongly accused. He requests an attorney and declines to make any statement, which is his right but also suggests someone who understands the legal system well enough to know that silence is often the best defense against serious charges. The arrest sends shockwaves through Postal Service headquarters, generating immediate speculation about how deep the corruption extends and whether other senior officials might also be compromised. You're back in Philadelphia when news of Edmonds' arrest reaches you, delivered by Davidson, who looks simultaneously vindicated and troubled by the revelation that his own reports were being monitored by the person supposedly overseeing the investigation into the fraud network those reports described. The office atmosphere is subdued, inspectors working quietly at their desks but occasionally exchanging glances that convey shared understanding of how fundamentally this discovery has shaken their confidence in institutional hierarchy. The prosecutions proceed over the following months with methodical attention to detail and evidence. Edmonds eventually accepts a plea agreement rather than face trial, admitting to receiving payments from the fraud network in exchange for protecting its operations and misdirecting investigations that got too close to discovering key participants. He receives a sentence of 15 years in federal prison, which seems simultaneously severe and insufficient given the scope of his betrayal. Voss and Mary Voss both testify as prosecution witnesses and receive reduced sentences of 8 and 5 years respectively. Brennan and Whelan, whose cooperation was valuable but less comprehensive than Sterling's, receive 10-year sentences. Margaret Sterling's immunity agreement spares her from prison time, though she's barred from operating any financial services business and placed under supervised probation for 10 years. But you probably wouldn't expect what happens 6 months later when you receive a letter that makes you reconsider everything you thought you understood about the investigation's conclusion. The letter arrives on a morning in late April 1893, delivered with the regular mail to your desk at the Philadelphia office where you've returned to routine investigative work after the intensity of the fraud network case. The envelope is plain, bearing no return address, postmarked from Chicago 3 days earlier, and something about its anonymity makes you open it with more attention than you'd give to typical correspondence. Inside is a single page written in careful handwriting that you don't immediately recognize, though there's something familiar about the precise formation of letters that triggers a vague sense of having seen this script before. The letter begins without preamble. Inspector Mitchell, congratulations on the successful prosecution of the mail fraud network. Your investigative work was thorough and your persistence commendable. However, I feel obligated to inform you that certain aspects of the case remain incomplete. The network you dismantled was substantial but not unique. Similar operations continue in other regions, and the methods you discovered are being replicated by individuals who learned from Edmonds' mistakes. Consider this a professional courtesy from someone who respects competent law enforcement even while operating on the opposite side of it. The postal system is vast, and corruption finds opportunities in any large bureaucracy. Stay vigilant. A former participant. You read the letter twice, trying to determine whether it's a genuine warning or merely an attempt to unsettle you, to suggest that your investigation's success was somehow incomplete, or that the fraud network continues despite arrests and prosecutions. The tone is neither threatening nor mocking, just matter-of-fact acknowledgement of ongoing criminal activity presented as if it's simply another aspect of postal operations that coexists with legitimate mail delivery. The phrase former participant particularly bothers you because it suggests someone involved in the network who wasn't arrested, someone who escaped prosecution, and now operates with enough confidence to contact you directly. You show the letter to Warren, who reads it with his characteristic lack of visible reaction before saying, "Probably Sterling. She'd have reason to reach out, having avoided prison through cooperation, and she'd know enough about operations to claim insider knowledge." It's a reasonable theory, but something about the letter's phrasing doesn't quite match Sterling's testimony or personality as you understood it from reading transcripts of her interviews. Sterling was pragmatic and businesslike in her cooperation, motivated primarily by self-preservation, while this letter carries a different tone, almost philosophical, as if the writer finds something intellectually interesting about the ongoing battle between postal inspectors and the criminals who exploit the system's vulnerabilities. Davidson, when you show him the letter, suggests filing it as part of the case record but not pursuing active investigation unless additional evidence emerges of new fraud operations. "We disrupted a major network and put its leadership in prison," he points out. "If there are other operations out there, they'll surface eventually through complaints and irregularities, and we'll investigate them using the same methods that proved effective against Edmonds' network. You can't prevent all crime, you can only respond to it professionally when it occurs." His perspective is pragmatic and probably accurate, but it doesn't entirely satisfy the part of you that wonders whether the investigation really concluded as completely as everyone assumed, whether there might be other senior officials who learned from Edmonds' example and are now operating with greater caution, whether the network's disruption was actually as significant as the prosecution statistics suggest. These thoughts occupy your mind periodically over the following weeks, as you return to routine work, investigating occasional mail theft complaints, conducting facility audits, testifying in minor fraud cases that lack the complexity or scope of the Edmonds network. Summer arrives with its particular Philadelphia heat, the kind that makes walking through the city feel like moving through warm water, and postal facilities become stifling during afternoon shifts when sorting rooms trap heat and poorly ventilated spaces make concentration difficult. You're reviewing a complaint about missing catalog orders when Whitmore visits the Philadelphia office, ostensibly to consult with Davidson about administrative matters, but actually, you suspect, to check on how various inspectors are adjusting after the intensity of the fraud network investigation. He asks if you've had time to reflect on the case, what lessons you've drawn from the experience, and you mention the anonymous letter you received in April, curious about whether Whitmore might have insights into who sent it, or whether similar letters have reached other inspectors involved in the prosecution. His expression shifts slightly, not quite surprise but recognition that you've touched on something he's been thinking about as well. Can you sense that particular quality of unfinished business, the way solved cases sometimes leave questions that formal conclusions can't entirely resolve? Whitmore explains that he's received similar correspondence, not identical but carrying the same tone of informed observation from someone familiar with the network's operations. His letter suggested that Edmonds, despite his cooperation and guilty plea, withheld certain information during his testimony, protecting individuals or operations that he considered too valuable or too dangerous to expose. The letter writer claimed that Edmonds' silence on these matters was strategic, preserving options for potential future involvement in criminal activities after his eventual release from prison, or maintaining leverage over other participants who might someday be in a position to assist him. The possibility that Edmonds might have provided incomplete testimony despite his plea agreement is troubling but not entirely surprising. Criminals often hedge their cooperation, revealing enough to satisfy prosecutors while holding back information that serves their own interests, and Edmonds was sophisticated enough to understand how to manipulate the legal system, even while appearing to fully cooperate with it. The challenge is that without specific evidence of what information he withheld, there's no basis for challenging his testimony or seeking additional prosecution. And prosecutors are generally satisfied when major cases conclude with significant convictions regardless of whether every detail has been exposed. Whitmore has been quietly investigating whether any of the network's known participants might have escaped prosecution, reviewing testimony and financial records to identify gaps or inconsistencies that could point toward undiscovered conspirators. So far, this investigation has produced more questions than answers, revealing that the network's financial operations were more complex than Sterling's ledgers fully captured, with multiple layers of accounts and transfers that suggest additional facilitators beyond those who were arrested. Following these financial trails requires cooperation from banks and financial institutions that are often reluctant to share customer information even with federal investigators. creating obstacles that slow progress and limit what can be discovered. You ask whether Whitmore thinks the anonymous letter writer might actually be offering to cooperate, using indirect communication to test whether postal inspectors would be receptive to additional information without immediately demanding the writer's arrest. It's not uncommon for criminals who've avoided prosecution to eventually seek some form of redemption or settlement with law enforcement, particularly if they fear that former associates might expose them, or if they calculate that cooperation now might earn leniency if they're ever caught for other crimes. Whitmore considers this possibility, then shakes his head slowly. The letters don't read like offers of cooperation. They read more like intellectual observation, someone commenting on an interesting phenomenon from a safe distance. Whoever wrote them isn't afraid of being caught and doesn't seem motivated by guilt or self-preservation, just curiosity about whether we understand that the problem we addressed extends beyond what we preservation. The conversation shifts to other topics: administrative changes in the Postal Inspection Service following Edmonds' arrest, new procedures for reporting and reviewing potential corruption among senior officials, proposals for improving communication between different district offices to identify fraud patterns more quickly. These institutional responses to the scandal are necessary and probably helpful, but they also feel somewhat inadequate to address the fundamental reality that large bureaucracies will always create opportunities for corruption, and determined criminals will always find ways to exploit those opportunities regardless of what procedures are implemented to prevent them. As summer progresses into autumn, the intensity of the fraud network case gradually fades from daily consciousness, becoming part of institutional memory rather than active investigation. You continue your work in Philadelphia, occasionally consulting on cases in other districts when your experience with the network proves relevant, and gradually the rhythm of routine investigation re-establishes itself. The anonymous letter remains in your desk drawer, occasionally reviewed when you're trying to understand some aspect of current cases, serving as a reminder that investigations conclude but the criminal activities they address often merely transform and relocate, rather than disappearing entirely. One afternoon in October, almost exactly a year after you first started watching Thursday evening operations at the Northern District Sorting Facility, you receive word that Whelan has been released from prison early due to health complications. His sentence was reduced for cooperation, and apparently his health has deteriorated enough that prison officials recommended compassionate release to allow him to spend his remaining time with family. You feel neither satisfaction nor sympathy at this news, just a kind of neutral acknowledgement that cases involve actual people whose lives continue beyond prosecution and sentencing, sometimes in ways that feel like justice, and sometimes in ways that feel arbitrary. The letter carrier who replaced Whelan on the Northern District route is a young man who seems earnest and conscientious, and you occasionally observe him making his rounds with the kind of careful attention that suggests he takes pride in delivering mail accurately and reliably. Watching him reminds you of why the Postal Service matters, why investigating fraud against it isn't just bureaucratic enforcement but actually protection of something valuable. The idea that letters and money orders and packages can move across vast distances and arrive at their intended destinations, that people can trust this system enough to use it for important communications and financial transactions, that corruption can be identified and prosecuted even when it extends to senior levels of administration. But I haven't told you the most important part yet about what happens 2 years later when you encounter someone who makes you understand the true significance of that anonymous letter. The encounter happens in Chicago during the autumn of 1894. When you're there consulting on a case involving fraudulent mail order catalogs that promise agricultural equipment but deliver inferior goods or nothing at all. It's routine work, the kind that fills most of an inspector's time, and you're meeting with the Chicago district supervisor to review complaint patterns when you notice a woman standing near the entrance of the postal facility, watching the building with the focused attention of someone waiting for a specific person rather than simply passing time. Something about her posture strikes you as familiar, though you can't immediately place why, and as you exit the building she approaches with deliberate purpose, introducing herself as Catherine Morris, a name that means nothing to you until she adds quietly, "We met briefly 2 years ago, though you knew me then as someone else." The recognition comes slowly. This is Margaret Sterling, though her appearance has changed significantly since her testimony in St. Louis. Her hair is styled differently, her clothes are more modest, and she carries herself with less of the confident businesswoman affect she projected during the fraud network's operation. She asks if you have time for coffee, saying she has information that might interest you regarding matters you investigated previously. And despite some hesitation about meeting privately with someone who is involved in criminal activities, you agree, curious about what she might want to discuss. The cafe she chooses is small and quiet, the kind of place where conversations can happen without attracting attention. And once you're seated with cups of weak coffee between you, she explains why she sought you out. "I wrote that letter you received last year," she says without preamble. "The one suggesting the network continued beyond what you prosecuted. I wanted to see whether postal inspectors would remain vigilant or whether you'd consider the case closed and move on to other work. Your reaction told me what I needed to know about whether to make contact directly. You ask why she would take such a risk, reaching out to someone who could theoretically have her arrested for violating terms of her immunity agreement, and she explains that her cooperation with prosecution was genuine but incomplete. She provided truthful testimony about the network's financial operations and her own role in them, but she withheld certain information about participants who weren't directly involved in the theft operations she coordinated, people who provided services or support to the network without necessarily understanding its criminal nature or the full scope of its activities. One of those people was a postal clerk in New York, Sterling continues, someone who processed documentation for legitimate money order transactions but occasionally falsified records when asked by Edmonds, believing it was authorized by senior management for auditing purposes. This clerk is still employed by the Postal Service, still in a position where similar falsification could occur if someone approached with the right combination of authority and compensation. I'm telling you this because I don't want to see another network develop using the same vulnerabilities that Edmonds exploited. The information she provides is specific enough to be verifiable. The clerk's name, work location, types of falsification performed, approximate dates when these activities occurred. She explains that she's sharing this not out of altruism exactly, but because she's attempting to build what she calls a different kind of life. One where she's no longer profiting from criminal activities, but also no longer carrying the weight of knowing about ongoing vulnerabilities without reporting them. The immunity agreement that spared her from prison has also burdened her with awareness that the system's weaknesses remain exploitable, and she's decided that living with that knowledge is more difficult than the risk of contacting you directly. You listen without interrupting, trying to assess whether this is genuine remorse and cooperation, or merely another manipulation, another attempt by someone skilled at deception to shape your perception for reasons that serve her interests rather than justice. Sterling seems to anticipate this skepticism, adding, "You don't have to trust my motives, just verify the information I've provided, investigate the clerk I've identified, and determine for yourself whether the vulnerabilities I'm describing actually exist. If they do, address them. If they don't, then I've wasted your time but caused no harm." Can you feel that tension between skepticism and the obligation to investigate credible information regardless of its source, or the motivations behind its disclosure? The investigation of Sterling's information takes several weeks, requiring coordination with New York postal inspectors and careful review of money order processing records to identify the falsifications she described. What you discover confirms her basic account. A clerk named Harold Chen did process documentation in ways that violated standard procedures, creating records that made stolen money orders appear legitimate when they passed through verification checks. Chen's supervisor apparently never noticed these irregularities, or if he noticed, he attributed them to clerical errors rather than intentional falsification, which allowed the practice to continue intermittently over an 18-month period. When questioned, Chen admits to the falsifications but insists he believed he was following instructions from senior management, that Edmonds had contacted him claiming to conduct confidential audits that required temporary procedural adjustments. Chen saved the letters from Edmonds authorizing these adjustments, and the letters are sophisticated enough in their official formatting and terminology that someone without reason to question them would likely accept them as legitimate administrative directives. The fact that Chen retained the letters rather than destroying them as instructed suggests either he was more cautious than Edmonds anticipated, or that he had some instinct the instructions might someday need to be defended. Chen faces disciplinary action but not criminal prosecution. His violations deemed serious enough for dismissal but not rising to the level of knowing participation in fraud given his documented belief that he was following authorized procedures. The Postal Service implements new verification protocols designed to prevent similar falsification, and the New York District reviews its supervisory procedures to identify why Chen's irregular processing wasn't detected through normal oversight. These responses feel adequate but not particularly satisfying, addressing symptoms of the problem without fully resolving the underlying reality that large bureaucratic systems will always have individuals who can be manipulated through fake authority or convinced to bend rules for seemingly legitimate purposes. You meet with Sterling once more before leaving Chicago, thanking her for the information while also making clear that cooperation doesn't erase her previous criminal activities or create any ongoing relationship between you. She accepts this with the pragmatic understanding of someone who expected nothing more, saying only that if she becomes aware of other vulnerabilities or continuing criminal operations, she'll consider whether disclosure serves both justice and her own interests in remaining free from further prosecution. It's an honest acknowledgement that her cooperation is transactional rather than purely ethical, which somehow makes it more credible than if she'd claimed moral reformation. The years that follow bring gradual changes to postal inspection operations. Edmonds' betrayal leads to increased scrutiny of senior officials, implementation of financial disclosure requirements, and rotation policies designed to prevent any single person from accumulating too much control over investigative priorities and resources. These reforms improve accountability, but also create new bureaucratic obstacles that sometimes slow legitimate investigations, and inspectors learn to navigate the tension between necessary oversight and the flexibility required for effective detective work. Warren retires in 1896, his damaged hand finally limiting his ability to write the detailed reports that investigations require, and his departure leaves a gap in the office that subsequent replacements never quite fill despite their competence and dedication. You continue working as a postal inspector through the turn of the century, investigating fraud cases that range from simple to complex, training younger inspectors in techniques that proved effective during the Edmunds Network investigation, and occasionally reflecting on how that case shaped your understanding of institutional corruption and the persistent nature of criminal exploitation of system vulnerabilities. The anonymous letter remains in your files, a reminder that solved cases represent moments of success within ongoing struggles rather than permanent victories over fraud and theft. Davidson eventually shares something he learned years after the prosecutions concluded. Edmunds, while in prison, attempted to orchestrate another fraud scheme using letters smuggled out through visitors, suggesting that his cooperation and apparent remorse during prosecution were merely tactical responses to circumstances, rather than genuine reformation. Prison officials intercepted the letters before any actual theft occurred, and Edmunds faced additional charges that extended his sentence. But the incident confirmed what the anonymous letter had implied about the incomplete nature of the investigation's resolution. Some criminals reform, some get caught repeatedly, and some continue pursuing illegal activities with intelligence and persistence that challenges even competent law enforcement. On quiet afternoons in the Philadelphia office, when routine work feels monotonous, and you wonder whether investigative efforts actually achieve lasting impact, you remember the specific faces and moments from the network case: Whelan's careful deception, Brennan's resignation, Voss's calculated cooperation, Sterling's pragmatic disclosures, and Edmunds' sophisticated manipulation of the system he was supposed to protect. These memories don't provide comfort exactly, but they offer perspective on why the work matters despite its frustrations and incomplete successes. But you probably wouldn't imagine how the story concludes, years later, with a discovery that makes you understand the full complexity of what you investigated and what remained hidden. The discovery comes in 1903, more than a decade after your initial investigation, when you're reviewing old case files as part of a departmental initiative to archive historical investigations that might provide training examples for newer inspectors. The Edmunds Network case is among those being catalogued, its documents organized chronologically, and its outcomes summarized in formal language that transforms months of uncertainty and effort into a neat narrative of successful prosecution. You're examining financial records from Sterling's ledgers when you notice an entry you'd somehow missed during the original investigation. A payment coded as JM secondary that appears quarterly alongside Edmunds' JE primary entries, though in smaller amounts, usually $500 to $800. The designation secondary suggests this person held a position of importance in the network, but subordinate to Edmunds, possibly someone who provided support or facilitation that was valuable enough to warrant regular compensation but not critical enough to command the larger percentages Edmunds received. You cross-reference this code with testimony transcripts, looking for any mention of secondary leadership or support roles, and you find a brief reference in Voss's interrogation, where he mentions that Edmunds occasionally consulted with another postal official about strategic decisions, though Voss never learned this person's identity or specific responsibilities. The initials JM mean nothing specific without additional context, but they trigger a vague memory of something you encountered during the investigation. Some detail that seemed insignificant at the time but now feels potentially important. You spend the afternoon reviewing case files, searching for any references to individuals with those initials who might have had connection to postal operations or to Edmunds personally, and eventually you find what you're looking for in a personnel roster from the Washington Postal Headquarters: James Morrison, Deputy Chief Inspector, who worked directly under Edmunds and continued in that position after Edmunds' arrest. Apparently cleared of any suspicion during the internal investigation that followed the scandal, Morrison's continued employment suggests he was either genuinely uninvolved in Edmunds' criminal activities, or sufficiently careful to avoid leaving evidence of his participation. But the quarterly payments in Sterling's ledgers, if JM secondary actually refers to Morrison, indicate someone who received substantial sums over an extended period in ways that parallel Edmunds' compensation from the network. The challenge is proving that Morrison is actually the person Sterling's code identifies, and that the payments represent criminal proceeds rather than legitimate income from sources unrelated to the fraud network. You bring this information to Davidson, who's now nearing retirement himself and has become less enthusiastic about pursuing complex investigations that might extend beyond his remaining time with the Postal Service. He examines the ledger entries and personnel records, then sighs in the way people do when confronted with problems they'd rather not address. Morrison has been with Postal Inspection for 19 years, he says. He was investigated thoroughly after Edmunds' arrest and nothing suspicious was found. If you pursue this now, based on coded entries in a criminal's ledger from a decade ago, you're going to need more than circumstantial connections. You understand his caution. Accusing a senior official of long-standing corruption based on limited evidence could backfire professionally if the accusation proves unfounded. And Morrison's position gives him credibility and institutional support that would make any investigation politically complicated. But the possibility that someone involved in Edmonds' network has remained in a position of authority for more than 10 years, potentially influencing investigations and protecting ongoing criminal activities, feels too significant to ignore simply because proving it would be difficult or professionally risky. Can you sense that weight of responsibility that comes from discovering information others would prefer remain hidden, knowing that acting on it requires courage but that failing to act might allow corruption to continue? The decision you make is to request Sterling's cooperation once more, reaching out through her last known address in Chicago to ask whether she can confirm that J. Emmett Secondary refers to James Morrison, and whether she has any additional information about his role in the network's operations. The response comes several weeks later, not from Sterling directly but from her attorney, explaining that she's reluctant to provide additional testimony without assurances that doing so won't jeopardize her immunity agreement or result in new charges related to information she previously withheld. The attorney suggests that if you can provide evidence that Morrison is actually connected to the network, Sterling would be willing to confirm details, but she won't be the primary source of accusations without corroboration from other sources. The corroboration eventually comes from an unexpected direction. Edmonds, still in prison, and apparently motivated by some combination of boredom and residual bitterness about his circumstances, sends a letter to the Justice Department offering to provide additional testimony about the fraud network in exchange for consideration of early release. The offer goes through multiple reviews and negotiations before reaching someone who recognizes its potential significance and contacts you to discuss what information Edmonds claims to possess that he didn't reveal during his original prosecution. You travel to the federal prison where Edmonds is held, a grim facility in upstate New York, where long-term federal prisoners serve their sentences in conditions that are harsh without being overtly brutal. Edmonds has aged noticeably since his arrest, his hair completely white now, his face deeply lined, but his eyes retain the intelligence and calculation you remember from his interrogation. He greets you with wary politeness, understanding that you're not there as a friend but as someone who might facilitate whatever arrangement he's seeking. "I've had considerable time to reflect on my mistakes," he begins. A preamble that sounds rehearsed and insincere. Among those mistakes was protecting certain individuals who should have faced consequences alongside me. James Morrison was more involved in the network's operations than I acknowledged during my testimony. He provided information about investigative activities in districts beyond my direct oversight, and he received compensation for that assistance through Sterling's financial operation. You ask why he's revealing this information now, after more than a decade of silence, and Edmonds responds with blunt honesty that's somehow more convincing than any claim of moral reformation would be. Morrison has continued advancing in postal inspection while I've been imprisoned. That imbalance bothers me, the sense that someone who participated in the same activities I did has suffered no consequences while I've lost everything. If providing testimony against him can reduce my sentence even slightly, that serves my interests regardless of any broader justice concerns. His cynicism is almost refreshing after years of hearing criminals claim remorse they don't actually feel, and his testimony over the following hours provides specific details about Morrison's involvement, dates of meetings, subjects of conversations, decisions that were made based on information Morrison provided about which investigations were getting close to discovering network activities. The testimony is credible enough to warrant further investigation, particularly when combined with Sterling's ledger entries, though you're aware that Edmonds' motivations make him a problematic witness, whose testimony defense attorneys would challenge vigorously. Armed with this new information, federal prosecutors reopen the investigation into the fraud network, focusing specifically on Morrison's potential involvement. The investigation proceeds quietly, without public announcement, reviewing financial records and interviewing former network participants who might have information about Morrison's activities. What emerges gradually over months of careful work is a picture consistent with Edmonds' testimony and Sterling's records. Morrison did provide support to the network, did receive compensation for that support, and did use his position to influence investigative priorities in ways that protected network operations from detection. Morrison's arrest happens in early 1904, executed with the same coordination and care that characterized Edmonds' arrest years earlier, and the parallels between the two cases are noted by postal inspectors who worked on both investigations. Morrison maintains his innocence more vigorously than Edmonds did, claiming that any payments he received from Sterling were legitimate consulting fees unrelated to criminal activities, and that Edmonds' testimony is merely vindictive fabrication by someone seeking reduced sentence through false accusations. His defense is plausible enough that the trial extends over several weeks, with prosecutors working to establish connections between Morrison's actions and network operations while defense attorneys emphasize the circumstantial nature of evidence and the questionable credibility of witnesses who are admitted criminals. The verdict, when it finally comes, is guilty on multiple counts of conspiracy and accepting bribes, though Morrison receives a shorter sentence than Edmonds, 8 years compared to the 15 Edmonds originally faced, possibly because his role was indeed secondary, or possibly because the jury had some doubt about the strength of evidence against him. His conviction brings a sense of completion to the original investigation, addressing what had been an incomplete resolution, and confirming that Sterling's anonymous letter was accurate in suggesting the network's complexity extended beyond what initial prosecutions revealed. But I haven't told you the most important part yet about what happens in the final years of your career when you discover something that makes you question whether even Morrison's prosecution truly concluded the case, or whether deeper layers remained hidden throughout. The final revelation comes in 1907, during your last year before retirement, when you're contacted by a researcher from the Library of Congress, who's compiling a history of Postal Service operations and wants to interview inspectors who worked on significant fraud cases. You agree to the interview partly out of professional obligation, and partly because you're curious what perspective historical distance might provide on investigations that consumed years of your working life. The researcher, a young woman named Eleanor Hayes who approaches the work with academic thoroughness, asks detailed questions about the Edmonds network case, taking notes in precise shorthand as you describe the investigation's development and eventual prosecutions. During this conversation, she mentions having reviewed Postal Service administrative records from the period, and finding references to an internal audit conducted in 1888, 4 years before your investigation began, that identified irregularities in money order processing across multiple districts. The audit apparently noted patterns suggesting systematic theft, but concluded that the irregularities were likely due to procedural inconsistencies rather than intentional fraud, and its recommendations focused on improving documentation and oversight, rather than launching criminal investigations. You'd never heard of this audit during your investigation, which seems odd given that it described patterns very similar to what you eventually discovered. Hayes provides you with copies of the audit report, which was filed in administrative archives, and apparently forgotten after its recommendations were only partially implemented. Reading it now, more than 15 years after your investigation, you recognize descriptions that match the fraud network's operations almost exactly: money orders disappearing during specific shifts, complaints concentrated in certain geographic patterns, amounts falling within ranges that suggested deliberate selection rather than random loss. The audit was conducted by a team of senior postal officials including, you notice with growing unease, James Edmonds and James Morrison, who were tasked with reviewing operational efficiency and identifying areas for improvement. The implications unfold slowly as you consider what this means. Edmonds and Morrison weren't simply corrupted postal officials who opportunistically exploited system vulnerabilities they discovered while performing legitimate duties. They were officials who identified vulnerabilities through authorized audit work, and then deliberately chose to exploit those vulnerabilities for criminal profit, rather than addressing them through the reforms they were supposed to recommend. The 1888 audit that should have prevented the fraud network instead became its blueprint, providing Edmonds and Morrison with detailed knowledge of exactly where and how systematic theft could occur without triggering immediate detection. More troubling is the realization that if Edmonds and Morrison conducted the 1888 audit, and then began operating the fraud network shortly afterward, their criminal activities extended further back than anyone involved in the prosecution understood. The investigation focused on operations from 1890 onward, based on available evidence, but if the network actually began in 1888 or 1889, it operated successfully for several additional years, generated additional stolen proceeds that were never recovered, and involved participants who were never identified because investigators didn't know to look for activities during that earlier period. You contact Whitmore, now retired but still living in Philadelphia, and occasionally consulting on postal inspection matters, and you share Hayes' research with him. He reads the audit report with the same growing recognition you experienced, seeing patterns and connections that should have been obvious if anyone had thought to search administrative archives for historical context. "We assumed Edmonds was clever," Whitmore says eventually, "but this suggests he was more calculated than we gave him credit for. He didn't just exploit system weaknesses, he documented them officially and then used that documentation as an operational guide for theft." The question becomes whether to pursue this information further, whether to reopen an investigation into criminal activities that occurred more than 15 years ago, and involved individuals who are already imprisoned or deceased. The practical challenges are significant. Witnesses would have difficulty remembering events from so long ago. Financial records might no longer exist, and prosecutors would question whether additional charges against Edmonds and Morrison would serve any purpose beyond symbolic completeness. But there's also the possibility that the earlier network operations involved participants who were never identified, who escaped prosecution because investigators focused only on more recent activities, who might still be in positions where they could facilitate similar crimes. Can you feel that mixture of frustration and acceptance that comes from understanding that investigations, no matter how thorough they seem at the time, often miss crucial context that only becomes visible with distance and chance discoveries? The decision you make in consultation with Whitmore and current postal inspection leadership is to document the findings from Hayes's research but not to launch a formal reinvestigation. The reasoning is pragmatic. Edmonds and Morrison are already serving sentences that reflect the seriousness of their crimes. Additional charges would add little to their punishment, and the resources required for historical investigation would be better applied to addressing current fraud cases that threaten ongoing postal operations. This conclusion feels simultaneously sensible and insufficient, acknowledging limitations while accepting that perfect justice is rarely achievable in complex cases involving sophisticated criminals and institutional failures. What does emerge from this final revelation is a clearer understanding of how the fraud network developed, and why it proved so difficult to detect. Edmonds and Morrison didn't stumble into criminal activity through gradual moral compromise or opportunistic exploitation of weaknesses they happened to notice. They systematically studied the postal system's vulnerabilities through authorized work, identified specific opportunities for undetectable theft, and then constructed a criminal enterprise based on that authorized research. Their betrayal was premeditated in ways that go beyond simple corruption, representing a deliberate perversion of official responsibilities into criminal planning. This understanding influences how postal inspection training evolves in subsequent years. The case becomes a primary example of insider threat, studied by new inspectors as illustration of how authority and inside knowledge can be weaponized for criminal purposes when individuals prioritize personal gain over institutional obligations. The reforms implemented after Edmonds' conviction, enhanced oversight of senior officials, rotation of investigative assignments, financial disclosure requirements, are recognized as necessary but insufficient protections against determined corruption, and additional measures focus on cultural changes that encourage reporting of suspicious behavior, even when that behavior comes from respected authorities. Your retirement comes quietly in late 1907, marked by a modest ceremony attended by colleagues and a few officials who recognize your contributions to postal inspection over nearly 2 decades of service. You receive the standard letters of commendation and appreciation, expressions of gratitude for work that protected postal operations and maintained public trust in mail delivery. Words that feel meaningful even though they're conventional. The cases you worked, particularly the Edmonds Network investigation, become part of institutional memory, referenced in training, and occasionally discussed when similar patterns emerge in other contexts. In retirement, you find yourself thinking occasionally about the investigation and what it revealed about institutional vulnerability in human nature. The fraud network operated successfully for years because people trusted that postal officials were honest. That systematic theft on that scale couldn't occur without triggering obvious alarms, that someone in authority would notice and address irregularities before they became major crimes. These assumptions weren't foolish. Institutions generally do function reasonably well, and most officials are reasonably honest, but they created blind spots that Edmonds exploited with calculation and discipline. The lesson, if there is one, is that trust must be balanced with verification, that authority requires accountability, and that vigilance against corruption is ongoing work rather than a problem that can be solved once and forgotten. The Postal Service continues its operations, delivering millions of letters and packages across expanding networks that reach into territories becoming states and cities growing beyond anyone's prediction. Mail routes that once required weeks now require days, sorting facilities become more sophisticated, and money orders flow through systems with better documentation and oversight than existed in 1892. The reforms implemented after the fraud network's exposure contribute to these improvements, though whether they prevent all similar crimes or simply make them more difficult remains an open question that each generation of postal inspectors must answer through their own vigilant work. On quiet evenings, you sometimes review the case files you kept, reading through testimony transcripts and examining documents that once seemed crucially important, and now feel like historical artifacts from a different era. The names and faces remain vivid. Whelan's careful deception, Brennan's resignation, Sterling's pragmatic cooperation, Edmonds' cold calculation, and they remind you that behind every fraud case are actual people making choices that seem reasonable to them in their circumstances, even when those choices cause harm to systems and individuals who trusted that the mail would arrive safely and money orders would reach their intended recipients. The story doesn't have a neat conclusion because real investigations rarely do. They reveal what can be discovered within constraints of time and resources and luck. They address problems that existed during specific periods, and they leave questions about what remains hidden, or what new variations of old problems might be developing beyond current visibility. The Edmonds Network case accomplished significant things. Major criminals were prosecuted, a fraud operation was disrupted, reforms were implemented that improved postal security. But it also left mysteries unsolved, participants unidentified, and vulnerabilities that determined criminals might still exploit if they combine intelligence with patience and willingness to betray trust. Perhaps the most honest thing you can say about the investigation is that it mattered in ways both concrete and incomplete. Mail became slightly safer because of work you and your colleagues did. Some criminals faced consequences for their actions. The Postal Service learned lessons that improved its operations. These outcomes are valuable even if they're not perfect, even if they don't prevent all future fraud, even if deeper complexities remained hidden throughout the investigation and might never be fully understood. Sometimes doing important work means accepting that success is partial, and that the struggle against corruption continues beyond any individual case or career. And so the case rests in archives, documented thoroughly, understood incompletely, serving as reminder and warning and example for those who come after, who will face their own versions of postal fraud requiring the same patient investigation and careful prosecution that solved parts of this case while other parts remained in shadow, waiting perhaps for future investigators to discover through their own chance encounters with forgotten documents or unexpected testimony from sources who finally decide that silence serves neither their interests nor justice. The evening settles gently over Philadelphia, the city quieting into its nighttime rhythms as lamps are lit and families gather for supper, and the last mail wagons make their rounds through streets that have seen so many similar evenings across decades of postal service operations. Somewhere in this vast network of letters and packages and money orders, the work continues as it always has, carriers walking their routes, sorters processing tomorrow's deliveries, inspectors watching for irregularities that might signal problems requiring attention. The Edmunds case becomes one story among many in the long history of postal operations, significant to those who worked it but gradually fading into the background of institutional memory as newer cases and different challenges occupy current attention. The reforms it prompted remain in place, modified and updated but still reflecting lessons learned from that investigation into systematic fraud that operated for years before being discovered and addressed through patient detective work and cooperation among inspectors across multiple districts. You rest now, knowing you've completed your part of this ongoing work, that others will continue what you began, that the Postal Service will adapt and improve and face new challenges that require the same dedication and integrity you tried to bring to your investigations. The evening deepens into night, stars appear